Good morning, future CAs. So let us start with the topic using the work of internal auditor. और अपन सबसे पहले समझते हैं व्हाट इज द मीनिंग ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट। तो अपन एक काम करते हैं, सबसे पहले अपन ये समझते हैं कि इंटरनल ऑडिट का मतलब क्या होता है। इंटरनल ऑडिट का मतलब क्या होता है? सो इट्स अ फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी, मतलब ये एक एंटिटी का एक ये हिस्सा है दैट परफॉर्म्स अश्योरेंस एंड कंसल्टिंग सर्विसेज। तो ये क्या करता है? अश्योरेंस एंड कंसल्टिंग एक्टिविटीज परफॉर्म करता है। अब किस चीज से अश्योरेंस देता है, किस चीज की कंसल्टिंग एक्टिविटीज देता है? तो मैंने बोला इट्स अ फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी which performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. So, what is internal audit? It's a function of an entity. So, it's a function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities, जो कि assurance देता है and consult करता है। मतलब we can consult with them. So it's a function of an entity that renders assurance and consulting activities, and it is designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance. It is designed to evaluate and improve. What it is designed to evaluate and improve is the entity's governance, रिस्क मैनेजमेंट एंड इंटरनल कंट्रोल प्रोसेसेस। तो मैं अगर समरी बताऊं तो आपको याद होगा चैप्टर नंबर 3 में हमने कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल समझा था। तो जहां पे हमने बोला इंटरनल कंट्रोल के 5 कंपोनेंट्स है। वन इज कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट, सेकंड इज एंटिटीज रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसेस, third is information system and communication that also includes the related business process relevant to the financial reporting. Then fourth was the control activities and fifth was the monitoring of internal controls. तो monitoring of internal controls में हमने बोला था it can be done either through an ongoing activities or by way of separate evaluation. तो monitoring of control जो करता है generally, that is the internal audit department. So it's the function of an entity. So internal audit does the monitoring of internal control. So it's the function of an entity that provides assurance and consulting activities with to evaluate and improve, that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance. तो governance का लिंक हो जाता है कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट के साथ, रिस्क मैनेजमेंट का लिंक हो जाता है एंटिटीज रिस्क असेसमेंट के साथ, एंड देन इंटरनल कंट्रोल प्रोसेसेस। तो यहाँ पे आप बिजनेस प्रोसेस की अंडरस्टैंडिंग लेते हो, फिर आप उसमें से रेलेवेंट कंट्रोल एक्टिविटीज को समझते हो। तो ये दीज टू स्टेप्स आर रिलेटेड एंड देयरफॉर द बिलो पॉइंट दैट इज इंटरनल कंट्रोल प्रोसेसेस इज आल्सो रिलेटेड। तो मैंने बोला इंटरनल ऑडिट क्या होता है? मैंने बोला इट्स द फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी। ये एक ऐसा फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी है that provides assurance and consulting activities, that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. So मैंने बोला internal audit is a function of an entity that provides assurance and consulting activities to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. तो मैंने बोला बहुत सिंपल है, it's the internal audit is the function of an entity that provides assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's गवर्नेंस। एंटिटीज गवर्नेंस का पॉइंट लिंक हो जाता है कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट के साथ, एंटिटीज रिस्क असेसमेंट का पॉइंट लिंक हो जाता है रिस्क मैनेजमेंट के साथ, एंड इंटरनल कंट्रोल प्रोसेसेस का लिंक हो जाता है पॉइंट कंट्रोल एक्टिविटीज एंड अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ द बिजनेस प्रोसेसेस के साथ। सो अभी अपन मैं सिंपल शब्दों में समझाऊं तो अपन ने बोला 5 कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल है। वन इज कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट, सेकंड वन इज entities risk assessment process, third one is information system including the related business process relevant to the financial reporting, then control activities, and then monitoring of controls. मैंने बोला monitoring of controls is done through the internal audit department, and it's the function of an entity that provide assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, ताकि entity की governance अच्छी हो पाए, risk management अच्छा हो पाए, and internal control processes अच्छे हो पाए। ठीक है, सो डिजाइन टू इवैल्यूएट एंड इम्प्रूव, ताकि वो इवैल्यूएट कर पाए एंड देन सजेस्ट फॉर इम्प्रूवमेंट्स व्हाट हाउ कैन एंटिटी गवर्नेंस, रिस्क मैनेजमेंट एंड इंटरनल कंट्रोल प्रोसेसेस बी इम्प्रूव्ड। ठीक है, तो मैंने बोला इट्स द फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी दैट प्रोवाइड्स assurance and consulting activities अब हमने सबसे पहले आपको अगर इसको समझना है इंटरनल ऑडिट की डेफिनेशन, तो व्हाट यू डू, यू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट आर द कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ द इंटरनल कंट्रोल। तो मैंने बोला देयर आर 5 कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल। वन इज कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट, सेकंड वन इज एंटिटीज रिस्क असेसमेंट, थर्ड वन इज इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम एंड कम्युनिकेशन, फोर्थ वन इज कंट्रोल एक्टिविटी एंड फिफ्थ वन इज मॉनिटरिंग ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल। जब हमने मॉनिटरिंग ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल पढ़ा था तो हमने पढ़ा था इट कैन बी कैरिड आउट एज पार्ट ऑफ द ऑनगोइंग एक्टिविटीज, और it can be carried out as a one time operation, मतलब or you can say it can be part of the ongoing activities, या फिर यू कैन से सिस्टमैटिक वे में आप वन टाइम पे करते हो। तो मैंने बोला दोनों ही केसेस में यू कैन इन्वॉल्व इंटरनल ऑडिट। तो इंटरनल ऑडिट ये एक ऐसा फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी है जो कि मॉनिटरिंग ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल्स के ऊपर काम करता है। इट्स द फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी दैट प्रोवाइड्स assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the entities risk management, entities governance, then internal control process। तो एंटिटी की गवर्नेंस को बढ़ाने के लिए इवैल्यूएट एंड इम्प्रूव, इवैल्यूएट मींस आपको इवैल्यूएट करना वेयर इज द फ्लॉ एंड देन यू नीड टू इम्प्रूव आल्सो, ठीक है। देन द ऑब्जेक्टिव एंड स्कोप ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, तो अभी हमने जो ऊपर पढ़ा स्कोप, दैट इज गवर्नेंस, रिस्क मैनेजमेंट, एंड थर्ड वन इज you can say improving the evaluate and improve the internal control processes। So the objective and scope of the internal audit function typically includes assurance and consulting activities, जो भी हमने पढ़ा, designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance process को बढ़ाना, risk management को बढ़ाना, and internal control such as the following। What is the objective and scope of audit is to perform assurance and consulting activities, को perform करा, designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, ताकि entity की governance, risk management and internal control अच्छा हो पाए, ठीक है। अभी चलते हैं activities relating to governance, activities related to risk management, what is the activities related to the internal control, ठीक है। तो अभी अपन ने समझा है ना, what is the objective and scope of the internal audit function is to provide assurance and consulting activities, ठीक है, assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the entity's governance process, then risk management, then third one is internal control। So entities governance process में क्या होगा, ठीक है। So internal department will assess the governance process, मतलब क्या management, how the management run the business, how the TCWG oversee the operation। So the internal audit department will assess the governance process with respect to how the management enforce the ethics and values, how the performance management and accountability is taken care of, ठीक है, how they communicate, how management and TCWG communicate risk and control information to the appropriate areas of the organization, ठीक है, and how effective the communication is amongst between the management and the external auditors and the internal auditors, ठीक है, and the management। So what is the effectiveness of the communication among those charged with governance, external and internal auditors and the management, ठीक है। तो अगर आप एक काम करते हैं, इस पॉइंट को अगर अपन को समझना है एंटिटीज गवर्नेंस प्रोसेस को, तो एक काम करते हैं अपन रिवाइज करते हैं इंटरनल कंट्रोल का वो वाला जहां पे हमने पढ़ा था कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट क्या होता है, ठीक है। कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट क्या होता है एक बार वापस चलते हैं, अभी 2 मिनट में चलते हैं और वहां पे एक बार पूरा रीड आउट करते हैं, ठीक है। द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन में असेस द गवर्नेंस प्रोसेस in its accomplishment of objectives on ethics and value। So the internal audit may assess the governance process in the accomplishment of its objectives। तो आपको पता होगा जब हमने जब हमने पढ़ा था कंट्रोल इन्वायरमेंट के बारे में सबसे पहली बार, तो हमने बोला था कमिटमेंट टू कॉम्पिटेंस, ठीक है। हमने क्या क्या पॉइंट्स पढ़े थे, सो वन सेकेंड, परफेक्ट, ठीक है। ये हमने पढ़ा था कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ द इंटरनल कंट्रोल। तो कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट जब हमने पढ़ा था, द ऑडिटर शैल ऑब्टेन एन अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ द कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट, कि क्या मैनेजमेंट ने क्रिएट किया है, मेंटेन किया है अ कल्चर ऑफ ऑनेस्टी एंड एथिकल बिहेवियर, व्हाट इज द स्ट्रेंथ ऑफ दिस कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट एंड वेदर इट appropriate leader to assess whether this control environment foundation acts as a foundation to the other components of the internal control। What is included in the control environment is the governance and management functions, attitude, awareness and action of the TCWG, and then it sets the tone of the organization। What is the elements, अब ये very important है। तो internal audit will assess the effectiveness of the following, ठीक है। communication and enforcement of the integrity and ethical values. What is the commitment to competence? What is the participation level by the TCWG? What is the management philosophy and operating action, operating style towards? What is the management attitude and action towards financial reporting? What is the management attitude and action towards managing and taking business risk? And what is the management attitudes and action towards information processing, accounting functions, and personnel? What is the organizational structure? How does the assignment of authority and responsibility flows? And what are the human resource policies? तो ये जो अभी हमने points पढ़े, so this is part of the, you can say, this the internal audit function. This is the internal audit function will us evaluate and he will so they will evaluate and improve. ठीक है, तो evaluate and improve the entities governance process. Okay, so this is what we have learned. So the internal audit function may assess the governance process in its accomplishment of objectives of ethics and values. अभी हमने ऊपर पढ़ा था communication of and enforcement of the ethical behavior. ठीक है, so what is accomplishment of the objectives of the ethics and values? What is the how does the performance is managed and accountability is fixed? That is, you can say something around human resource policies, wherein the promotion policies framed in such a way that the people perform and they are accountable for their jobs, their work, they are accountable for their jobs and work. तो इसमें बेसिकली ये हो सकता है कि लेट्स सपोज चीफ फाइनेंशियल ऑफिसर है, ठीक है, तो उसको इस तरीके से उसका केपीआई लिंक कर दिया कि भाई उसको बोनस तभी ज्यादा मिलेगा जब एंटिटी की प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी मेंटेन रहेगी. ठीक है, सो व्हाट इज द परफॉर्मेंस मैनेजमेंट एंड अकाउंटेबिलिटी? What is the method of communicating risk and control information to appropriate areas of the organization? So how does the management communicate? And what is the effectiveness of the communication amongst TCWG, management and the auditors? ठीक है, external and internal auditors. ठीक है, तो we learned this activities relating to governance. तो मैंने बोला the internal audit function में assess, it may assess the governance process in its so internal audit may assess the governance process in accomplishment of the objectives of ethics and values. So whether the management was able to achieve its objectives of ethics and values, performance management and accountability, communicating risk and control to the appropriate areas of the organization, and effectiveness of communication amongst TCWG management and internal auditors and external auditors. अभी चलते हैं activities related to risk management. तो internal audit function may assist, ठीक है, may assist the entity. It may help the entity by identifying and evaluating what are the significant risks that the business have. ठीक है, so identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk and contributing to the improvement of the risk management and internal control. So what are the significant exposures to the risk? How we can you can say we can manage this risk and frame some internal controls to mitigate this risk. And the internal audit function may perform procedures to assess the entity in the detection of the fraud. तो अगर पता चला कंपनी में fraud हुआ है, तो internal audit department may be used to quantify the impact of the fraud. And अगर आपको hint है कि fraud हो रहा है, so it may help in the detection of the fraud. Okay, it may help in the detection of the fraud. So what is the entity activities related to risk management means? So it means identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk. What are the significant exposures to the risk? Then you can think of contributing to the improvement of the risk management. So based on the identification and you can say evaluation of the significant exposures to the risk, it can think of contributing the improvement of the risk management and internal control, and it can help the entity in the detection of the fraud. It can help the entity in the detection of the fraud. तो अभी मैंने बोला इंटरनल ऑडिट की डेफिनेशन को एक बार वापस समझते हैं. मैंने बोला इट्स द फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी, इंटरनल ऑडिट इज द फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी डिजाइन्ड टू प्रोवाइड, ठीक है, दैट परफॉर्म्स assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the entity's governance, the effectiveness of the entities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and entity's internal control processes. तो हमने तीन चीजें पढ़ी. What are the activities related to governance? तो मैंने बोला assess, you have to assess whether the management was able to implement the ethics, effectiveness of the ethics and values. you can say you have to assess the governance process in accomplishment of objective with respect to ethics and values, performance management and accountability. What is the communication of risk and controls information to the appropriate areas, and what is the frequency of communication between amongst TCWG management, internal auditors, external auditors. So activities relating to governance, then activities relating to risk management. So internal audit department can help in identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk, and it can also help in contributing to the improvement of the risk management and internal control. तो रिस्क को कैसे मैनेज करें और कैसे हम इंटरनल कंट्रोल लगाए, इट कैन आल्सो हेल्प इन दैट थिंग, एंड इट इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन में आल्सो हेल्प इन द डिटेक्शन ऑफ द फ्रॉड. So it can help in identification and you can say identification and evaluating what are the significant exposures to the risk, and how can you improve the risk management and internal control. ठीक है, so identify and evaluate significant exposures to the risk and contributing to the improvement of the risk management and internal control. And an internal audit function may perform procedures to assess the entity in the detection of fraud. So it can help in detecting the fraud. अभी चलते हैं activities relating to internal control. So evaluation of internal control, examination of financial and operating information, review of operating activities, and review of compliance with laws and regulation. So these are the 4 activities that it may perform in relation to internal control. तो एक काम करते हैं, नीचे वाले चार्ट से समझते हैं. ठीक है, तो मैंने बोला risk management means identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk. What is how can it contribute to the improvement of the risk management, कैसे वो risk को manage कर सकता है, and internal control, how it can contribute to the risk improvement of the risk management and internal control, and how can it assess the entity. So internal auditors can assist the entity in the detection of the fraud. ठीक है, in the detection of the fraud. अभी चलते हैं, they can also evaluate the internal control. ठीक है, internal, so मैंने बोला internal audit is the function of an entity that you can say is basically it provides assurance and consulting activities, whether the you can say that whether design to basically assess whether the control so to assess whether, so it's the you can say let me just revise. So internal audit is the it's the function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control process. Governance में वो क्या देखेगा कि क्या entity अपने objectives achieve कर पाएगी है with respect to ethics and values, performance management and accountability, communicating risk and control information to the appropriate areas of the organization, and communication among TCWG, external auditors, internal auditors, and management. What is the activities relating to risk management? So risk management means whether it was able to identify and evaluate what are the significant exposures to the risk and how it can contribute to improve the risk management and internal control. Okay, and then we also learned internal audit may help in detection of the fraud, and it can also help in activities relating to internal control. The first activity is the evaluation of the internal control. So they can review the controls, evaluate their operation. So they can evaluate the internal control. So they can review the controls, evaluate their operation, and recommend improvements. So they can review the controls, they will evaluate their operation. मतलब वो डिजाइन देख सकते हैं, ऑपरेटिंग इफेक्टिवनेस देख सकते हैं. रिव्यू द कंट्रोल मींस डिजाइन एंड इम्प्लीमेंटेशन को चेक करेगा. Operating effectiveness को means evaluate their operations and then recommending the improvements. The evaluation of internal control बहुत simple है. The internal audit function may be assigned specific responsibilities for reviewing the controls, evaluating their operation, and recommending improvements thereto. In doing so, the internal audit function function provides assurance on the control. तो मैंने बोला internal audit function का काम ही क्या है? So it is the function of an entity which provides assurance and consultancy activities designed to evaluate and improve. ठीक है? So it's the function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and then the internal control. Evaluation of internal control में ये क्या करेगा? It will review the control, whether they have been in operation, and then it will recommend improvements. So reviewing the controls, evaluating their operation, and recommending improvements. The example ले लेते हैं, the internal audit function might plan and perform tests or other procedure to provide assurance to the management and TCWG regarding the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness of internal control, including those controls that are relevant to the audit. So internal audit function may plan and perform test or other procedure. So मतलब basically they may perform testing or other procedure to provide assurance to the management and TCWG regarding the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness of internal control, including those controls that are relevant to audit. ठीक है, तो मैंने बोला design, implementation, and maintenance. तो मतलब they will review the control, they will review whether the control is operating effectively and suggest some recommendation for improvements. ठीक है, then internal auditors may examine financial and operating information. ठीक है, तो they may examine examination of the financial and operating information. So they may think of reviewing the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information. And they can also make some specific inquiry into individual items, including detailed testing of transaction balances and procedures. So examination of financial and operating information. So internal audit function may be assigned, may be given responsibility. So internal audit function may be assigned to review the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information. तो मैनेजमेंट कैसे मैनेजमेंट को जो फाइनेंशियल इंफॉर्मेशन प्रेजेंट होती है या जो ऑपरेटिंग इंफॉर्मेशन प्रेजेंट होती है कि कितने टन सामान बना, कितने रेवेन्यू आया, ठीक है, इट्स एन एग्जांपल ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल इंफॉर्मेशन. ऑपरेटिंग इंफॉर्मेशन का एग्जांपल हो गया कितना टन सामान बना, कितने टन प्रोडक्शन में आया डेटा, ठीक है, तो दिस इज ऑल ऑपरेटिंग इंफॉर्मेशन. सो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, it may be assigned to review the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information. And it can also make some specific inquiry into individual items, including detailed testing of transaction balances and procedures. So they may also make some specific inquiry into individual items like detailed testing of some transaction. कुछ एक ऐसा लाइन आइटम है जिसके बारे में मैनेजमेंट चाहता है कि इंटरनल ऑडिट डिपार्टमेंट टेस्टिंग करे, है ना, कोई ट्रांजैक्शन की टेस्टिंग करे या कोई बैलेंस की टेस्टिंग करे या कुछ स्पेसिफिक प्रोसीजर्स परफॉर्म करे. तो मैंने बोला इट मे हेल्प इन एग्जामिनेशन ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल एंड ऑपरेटिंग इंफॉर्मेशन. So internal audit function may be assigned to review the means. What are the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information? And it can also make some specific inquiry into individual items, including detailed testing of transaction balances and procedures. Then it may review the operating activities. So internal audit function may be assigned to review the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of the operations. तो मतलब जितना सामान यूज होना चाहिए था उतना ही सामान प्रोडक्शन में यूज हो रहा है. तो मान लो एक टन को बनाने के लिए 10 किलो लेट से कुछ रॉ मटेरियल चाहिए था. लेट से एक किलो चीनी बनाने के लिए मुझे 10 किलो शुगर केन चाहिए, ठीक है. तो अगर मुझे 10 किलो चीनी बनानी है तो मेरे 100 किलो से ज्यादा शुगर केन नहीं हो सकता. तो इकोनॉमी, इफेक्टिवनेस एंड एफिशिएंसी ऑफ द ऑपरेशंस. एंड इट में आल्सो रिव्यू कंप्लायंस विद लॉज एंड रेगुलेशन. The internal audit function may be assigned to review compliance with laws, regulation, and other external requirements, and with the management policies. क्या management policies के साथ compliance हो पा रहा है, and other internal requirement. तो क्या management policies and other internal requirements के साथ compliance हो पा रहा है. So what is the meaning of internal audit? तो मैंने बोला internal audit बहुत simple है. Internal audit is a function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the entity's governance, entity's risk management, and entity's internal control processes. It has got 4 scope and objective. The objective and scope of the internal audit function, very simple. The objective and scope of the internal audit function is to मैंने बोला entity assess the entities governance. So activities relating to governance, then activities relating to risk management, then activities related to internal controls. ठीक है, मैंने बोला activities relating to governance में क्या करेगा. Internal audit function will assess the governance process in its accomplishment of objective with respect to ethics and values, performance management and accountability, communication of risk and control to the key areas to the appropriate areas of the organization, and what is the communication level between the TCWG management, internal auditor, external auditors, okay, and management. What is the activities relating to risk management? So internal audit function would assist in identifying and evaluating what are the significant exposures to those to the risk and contributing to the improvement of risk management. How can we manage this risk and what controls we can put? Okay, so risk management and internal control may help करेगा. Internal audit function may also help in the detection of fraud. It may also internal audit function may perform procedures to assess the entity in the detection of the fraud. Then it will perform some activities relating to internal control, that is evaluation of the internal control. तो क्या so internal audit function will review the controls, then assess the operation of that control and recommend improvements. तो वो देखेगा कि क्या control is designed appropriately, whether it is in operation, that is it's implemented and it's in operation, and recommending improvements. So reviewing controls, evaluating their operation, and recommending improvements. These are the 3 points: means, design, implementation, and operating effectiveness. तीनों चीजें check कर सकता है and can recommend some improvements based on this examination, evaluation of the internal control. Then comes the examination of the financial and operating information. So internal audit function may be assigned to review the means used to identify, recognize, measure, classify, and report financial and operating information, and also make some specific inquiry into individual items like detailed transaction. एक transaction को पूरा देख सकता है internal auditor, या फिर he can also review of the operating activities, whether the operating activities are performed in an economic, efficient, and effective way. And he can also review the compliance with laws and regulation, including the management policies. मतलब compliance with laws and regulation does not always mean the external laws and regulation, but also means the internal laws and regulation which has been set up by the entity by way of policies and directives and other internal requirements. So it ensures both the compliance. So internal audit function may be involved to evaluate whether the entity is in compliance with the laws and regulation, whether it's an external law and regulation or it's an internal law and regulation with respect to the management's policy. So मैंने बोला objective and scope of internal audit function is to assess and evaluate the you can say assess and evaluate whether the entity is you can say what is the objective and scope. And I bola it's the objective of an internal audit function is to provide assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. अभी you have in the entity's governance process, you have to assess the governance process with respect to the accomplishment of the objective for the following: the ethics and values, performance management and accountability, communication of risk and control, and what is the effectiveness of the communication. Then risk management, internal audit function may assist the entity in identifying what are the risks, identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk, then how to manage this risk, that is risk management and internal control, and assess the entity in detection of fraud. Then evaluation of internal control, examination of the financial and operating information, then review of the operating activities and review of compliance with laws and regulation. These are the 4 things. ठीक है, ये आपको एकदम क्लियर हो गया होगा. ठीक है, अब एक सेकेंड रुको, अपन नेक्स्ट टॉपिक पे चलते हैं. So now we are studying ways in which external auditor may make the use of the internal audit function for the purposes of the audit. So how can he make the use of the internal audit functions work for the purposes of the audit? So what he can do? So the external audit may make use of the function for the purposes of the audit in one or more of the following ways. तो वो obtain कर सकता है information that is relevant to the external auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to the error or fraud. So he can obtain information. ठीक है, तो आपको पता होगा जब हमने कौन से वाला टॉपिक पढ़ा था, जब हमने रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसीजर्स के बारे में पढ़ा था, तो जब हमने इंक्वायरी पढ़ा था उसमें हमने पढ़ा था देयर आर 3 टाइप्स ऑफ प्रोसीजर. वन इज इंक्वायरी, सेकंड वन इज ऑब्जर्वेशन, एंड इंस्पेक्शन, थर्ड वन इज analytical procedures. करेक्ट, तो वहां पे हमने पढ़ा था इंक्वायरी इंक्वायरी विद द इंटरनल ऑडिट पर्सनल, ठीक है, कैन हेल्प यू, है ना। तो अगर मैं आपको दिखाता हूँ, फटाफट चलते हैं, एक काम करते हैं, वी कैन डायरेक्टली जंप ऑन टू दैट इंक्वायरी विद इंटरनल ऑडिट, ठीक है। तो हमने जब रिस्क असेसमेंट पढ़ा था, तो हमने ये देखा था इंक्वायरी, इंक्वायरी, वन सेकेंड, रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसीजर, लेट मी टाइप दिस, रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसीजर्स, ठीक है। तो अगर आप देखोगे रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसीजर्स, यहाँ पे चलते हैं अब अपन। तो रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसीजर्स जब अपन ने पढ़े, एक सेकेंड, यहाँ पे पढ़े अपन ने, करेक्ट। तो रिस्क असेसमेंट प्रोसीजर्स में हमने पढ़ा था देयर आर थ्री मेथड्स टू कलेक्ट द एविडेंसेस, ठीक है। तो मैंने बोला पहला इज इंक्वायरी, सेकेंड वन इज ऑब्जर्वेशन एंड इंस्पेक्शन, थर्ड वन इज एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स, करेक्ट। अभी हमने बोला था इंक्वायरी डायरेक्टेड टुवर्ड्स इंटरनल ऑडिट पर्सनल may provide information about the internal audit procedures performed during the year. What are the internal audit procedures performed during the year relating to the design and effectiveness? तो अभी हमने पढ़ा ना, evaluating the internal control, review the controls, then evaluate their operation and recommendation, है ना। तो बेसिकली हमने पढ़ा, तो we can inquire about the we can inquire internal audit personnel about the internal audit procedure performed during the year relating to design and effectiveness of the entity's internal control, and whether management has satisfactorily responded to the findings from those procedures. So whether management has satisfactorily responded to the findings which have been brought out by the internal auditor. तो मैंने बोला inquiries directed towards internal audit personnel may provide information about the internal audit procedures performed during the year. What are the internal audit procedures performed during the year, including relating to the design and effectiveness of the entity's internal control, and whether management has satisfactorily responded to the findings from those procedures. So we can inquire internal audit personnel, ठीक है, we can inquire the internal audit personnel. तो ऑब्वियसली बात है, एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर एंड इंटरनल ऑडिटर बोथ शुड वर्क इन बाय म्यूचुअली, ठीक है, बाय गोइंग हैंड इन हैंड, ठीक है। सो एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर may make use of the function that is the internal audit function for the purposes of the audit in one or more of the following ways. In one or more of the following ways, you can say external auditor may make the use of the internal auditor's work. So external auditor may make the use of the internal auditor work in the following cases, okay. So he can obtain information, so auditor can obtain information that is relevant to the external auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to error or fraud. So I can obtain information that includes, so risk assessment procedure includes inquiry, observation and inspection. Third one is analytical procedures. So I can obtain the information that that the internal audit function has already done. I can inquire with them. I can inquire with them for the purpose of my risk assessment. So I can obtain information. So you know what is the objective and scope of the internal audit function is to identify and evaluate significant exposures to the risk. Then it defines the risk management policy, and you can say controls to mitigate that risk, then contributing to improvement of the risk management and the internal control, and it also assists the entity in the detection of the fraud. So this was the part when we covered that the purpose of the internal audit is to evaluate and improve the entity's risk management, okay. So it's identification and evaluating the significant exposures to the risk, then contributing the improvement of the risk management and internal control, and you can say assist the entity in detection of fraud. So there were 3 points that we learned, right? So what are the ways in which the external auditor may make use of the internal audit function for the purposes of the audit? मैंने बोला there are 3 ways he can obtain information that is relevant to the external auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to error or fraud. So he can obtain some information from the internal auditor, because internal auditor also as part of evaluating and improving the entity's risk management, evaluates what it considers what are the entities. So he identifies and evaluates what are the significant exposures to the risk. He effectively respond to them by implementing some risk management framework and the controls, okay. So this is, you have to obtain information that is relevant to the external auditor's assessment of the, so you can think about obtaining information that is relevant for the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement, and then unless prohibited or restricted, या तो मना हो किसी लॉ में या यू आर रेस्ट्रिक्टेड टू यूज द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर, तो अनलेस प्रोहिबिटेड और रेस्ट्रिक्टेड टू द सम एक्सटेंट बाय लॉ और रेगुलेशन, तो इफ यू आर प्रोहिबिटेड या फिर यू आर रेस्ट्रिक्टेड बाय लॉ और रेगुलेशन, the external auditor after appropriate evaluation, so external auditor after evaluation may decide to use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function during the period in partial substitution for the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor. तो external auditor वाला जो बंदा है आफ्टर इवैल्यूएशन वो ये सोच सकता है कि क्या मैं इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन का जो काम किया हुआ है रिगार्डिंग द डिजाइन, regarding the implementation of the control, regarding the operating effectiveness of the control, क्या मैं उस काम को यूज कर सकता हूँ फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ माइंस टेस्टिंग, ठीक है। तो मैं अपनी टेस्टिंग के लिए क्या मैं जो इंटरनल ऑडिटर का काम, सो अनलेस प्रोहिबिटेड और रेस्ट्रिक्टेड टू द सम एक्सटेंट बाय लॉ और रेगुलेशन, the external audit after evaluation, after appropriate evaluation, may decide to use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function. So internal auditor may decide, external audit, sorry, external auditor may decide to use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function during the period in partial substitution of for the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor. So जो काम ऑलरेडी किया हुआ है इंटरनल ऑडिटर ने, तो एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर आफ्टर अप्रोप्रिएट इवैल्यूएशन में कंसिडर कि वो डायरेक्टली एविडेंस लेगा। इसके इसके इससे ज्यादा अच्छा क्या होगा, जो काम ऑलरेडी किया हुआ है इंटरनल ऑडिटर ने उसको वर्क को मैं यूज कर लेता हूँ। सो यूज द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फॉर ऑडिट एविडेंसेस। सो अनलेस प्रोहिबिटेड और रेस्ट्रिक्टेड टू द सम एक्सटेंट बाय लॉ और रेगुलेशन, external auditor after appropriate evaluation may decide to use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function. So I may decide to use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function during the period in partial substitution of the audit for the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor. So I can use it in substitution. So I can use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function in partial substitution of the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor. So external auditor after appropriate evaluation may consider to use the work of the internal audit function in partial substitution for the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor. ठीक है, तो जो एविडेंस मुझे डायरेक्टली लेने थे उसके बदले में मैंने क्या किया, आई हैव यूज द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन। या फिर तीसरा ऑप्शन क्या है, अनलेस प्रोहिबिटेड और रिस्ट्रिक्टेड टू द सम एक्सटेंट बाय लॉ और रेगुलेशन, सेम unless prohibited or restricted, the external auditor may use internal auditor to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor. तो external auditor बोल सकता है internal auditor को कि आप मेरे behalf पे प्रोसीजर्स कैरी आउट करो, आप मेरे बिहाफ पे प्रोसीजर्स कैरी आउट करो अंडर द डायरेक्शन, सुपरविजन एंड रिव्यू ऑफ माइंस। ठीक है, तो ये प्रैक्टिकली बहुत यूज होता है जहां पे एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर इंटरनल ऑडिटर को बोलता है कि यू कैरी आउट योर स्कोप एंड ऑब्जेक्टिव्स and under my direction, and you perform some of the specific activities for me so that I can leverage it as part of my external audit. So using the internal auditor to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor is also one of the element, or you can say one of the ways of using the work of internal auditor. तो मैंने बोला the external auditor may make use of the internal audit function for the purposes of the audit in one or more of the following ways. तो मैंने बोला obtaining information for the purpose of risk assessment, then using the work unless prohibited by law or regulation, and unless prohibited or restricted by some law or regulation, we need to evaluate whether the external auditor after appropriate evaluation may decide to use the work that has been performed by the internal audit function in partial substitution for the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor, and he may also direct, supervise and review the work of the internal auditor. The external auditor may use internal auditors to perform audit procedure under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor, referred to as direct assistance. अभी चलते हैं स्कोप ऑफ ऐसे 610 जो कि बात करता है what is the auditor's scope, you can say what is the scope of SS 610। तो मैंने बोला तीन सिचुएशन में हम we can use the work of internal audit function, but SS 610 covers only 2 out of those 3 situations. One is using the work of internal audit function as an audit evidence in substitution of the procedures to be performed by the external auditors directly. Okay, so using the work of internal audit function in obtaining audit evidences. So मैंने बोला using the work of internal audit function in obtaining audit evidences and using the internal auditors to provide direct assistance under the direction, supervision and review. तो ऊपर वाले जो 3 पॉइंट्स है उसको उनमें से 2 एस्पेक्ट्स को कवर करता है ऐसे 610. So SA610 deals with the external auditor's responsibility if using the work. क्योंकि ऊपर वाले में देखो आप समझो ये इस वाले में तो हम सिर्फ इंफॉर्मेशन ले रहे हैं तो देयर इज वी आर नॉट यूजिंग द वर्क. ठीक है, हम एक्चुअली में जो वर्क यूज कर रहे हैं दैट इज इन ओनली 2 सिचुएशंस. तो इसीलिए SA610 कवर्स ओनली 2 एस्पेक्ट. So standard on auditing SA610 deals with the external auditor's responsibility if using the work of the internal auditors. This includes using the work of internal audit function in obtaining audit evidence. So I am using the work that has already been done by the internal auditors in obtaining the audit evidences, and I'm using the internal auditors to provide direct assistance under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. So I am giving direction, I am giving supervision, I am giving review, I am reviewing their stuffs. So using internal auditors to provide direct assistance. This is very, very important. It is known as direct assistance. The first one is known as to use the work of internal auditor for obtaining audit evidences. Okay, in obtaining audit evidences. So what is the external auditor's responsibility if using the work of auditors? ठीक है, तो मैंने बोला you can use the work of the internal audit function in obtaining audit evidences. You can use the work of internal audit in obtaining audit evidences, and you can also use the work internal auditors to provide direct assistance under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. Very, very important. Nothing in this essay requires the external auditor to use the work of internal audit. The SA610 does not mandatorily says that you always have to use the work of internal auditor. So use of the internal audit function is the sole discretion of the external auditor. It does not impose any condition on the external auditor that you have to use the work of internal auditor only. It is not framed in such a way. It's the discretion of the external auditor whether he wants to use the function of internal audit for to obtaining audit evidences or to perform some procedures under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor, that is in providing direct assistance. Okay, so nothing in this essay requires the external auditor to use the work of the internal audit function to modify the nature or timing or reduce the extent of audit procedure to be performed directly by the external auditor. It remains the decision of the external auditor in establishing the overall audit strategy. So when setting up the scope, timing, and direction of the audit, you can say overall audit strategy. External auditor might decide, external auditor might decide what should be the use of the internal audit function in his audit. It's the sole discretion of the external auditors. Overall responsibility for the audit, external auditor's responsibility for the audit. So overall responsibility for the audit remains with the external auditor only. So it remains with the external auditor. Yeah. So we were discussing what is the external auditor's responsibility for the audit. तो हमने बोला auditor is solely responsible for the expression of his opinion and it cannot be undermined. मतलब he cannot escape from his responsibility if he involves the internal auditor. तो मैंने बोला overall responsibility भाई external auditor की है. So external auditor's responsibility for the audit. So internal auditor. So अभी अपन चलते हैं सबसे last point पे. ठीक है, external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed and responsibility is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So either I am using the work of the internal audit function in obtaining audit evidence or I am using internal auditors to provide direct assistance. In both of the case, the auditor's responsibility remains the same, that auditor have to express an opinion and it is not reduced. It is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So the overall responsibility still rests with the external auditor. So external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed, and that responsibility is not reduced by the external auditors' use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance on the engagement. So मैंने बोला external auditor is solely responsible for the audit opinion expressed and it is not reduced, and the responsibility is not reduced by the external auditors' use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. दोनों ही केसेस में the responsibility is not reduced and the expression of the opinion is the responsibility of the external auditor. Although they may perform although they may perform audit procedure, they means internal auditors may perform audit procedures similar to those performed by the external auditor. भले ही internal auditor will be able to perform the procedures similar to those what has been performed by the external auditor, neither the internal audit function nor the internal auditors are independent of the entity. तो जनरली इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन एंड नीदर द इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स, मतलब इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन मींस हो सकता है इन हाउस ही कंपनी ने इंटरनल ऑडिट का डिपार्टमेंट खोल रखा हो, तो नीदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन नॉर द इंटरनल ऑडिटर, मतलब हो सकता है कोई प्रोफेशनल फर्म बना रखा हो इंटरनल ऑडिटर, जैसे कोई सीए फर्म को इंटरनल ऑडिटर बना रखा हो. सो नीदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन नॉर द इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स आर इंडिपेंडेंट ऑफ द एंटिटी. तो जनरली दे आर नॉट इंडिपेंडेंट ऑफ द एंटिटी, ठीक है. एंड इज रिक्वायर्ड एंड एज यू नो ऐसे 200 require external auditor to be independent. तो basically आपको अगर उसका वर्क यूज करना है, आपको you can't solely rely on their work, ठीक है ना. तो मैंने बोला the point is external auditor's responsibility for the audit. So internal auditor is generally not fully independent, is not fully independent. So internal auditor is generally not fully independent as either employed by the organization या फिर professional firm होती है, but it might be something not, but management might be able to you can say impact the internal auditors first. So internal auditor is generally not fully independent. So it's not fully independent and इसलिए ऐसे 610 defines करता है some condition. तो ऐसे 610 when using the work of the internal audit function as an audit evidence in as an audit evidence in direct you can say जो external auditor directly लेता है उसके बदले में वो internal audit function के पास जो already evidences है उनसे उन्हें ले रहा है, ठीक है. तो ऐसे 610 define some conditions necessary for the external auditor to use the work of internal auditor. अब ये conditions की जरूरत क्यों थी? ताकि auditor do not overuse, ठीक है, over और undue use ना करे of such work that has already been performed by the internal auditor. So this essay therefore defines the conditions that are necessary for the external auditor to be able to use the work of internal auditor. And the requirements are designed to provide a framework for the external auditor's judgment regarding the use of the work of the internal auditor to prevent over or undue use of such work. तो मैंने बोला external auditor's sole responsibility. तो मैंने बोला external auditor is solely responsible for the expression of the opinion and it is not reduced by the involvement of the internal audit function. So by the use of the internal audit function or to engage internal auditors to provide direct assistance in the audit engagement. So external auditor has the sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed, and that responsibility is not reduced in either of the case, that is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance on the engagement. Although they may perform audit procedures. So generally internal auditors and external auditors both are qualified CAs, ठीक है, generally ऐसा होता है. So they may perform procedures similar to those performed by the external auditor, but neither the internal audit function nor the internal auditors are independent of the entity, and that is required by the external auditor in an audit of financial statement in SA 200. तो हमें basically we can't blindly rely on the work of the internal audit function because they are generally considered not to be independent of an entity. That's the general perception in the society because they are internal to the entity and therefore not much independent. Okay? Therefore, SA 610 defines the conditions that are necessary for the external auditor. It defines the conditions that are necessary for the external auditor to be able to use the work of internal auditors. ये कंडीशन इसलिए बनाई गई है that the auditor is prevented from overuse or undue use of the work of the internal auditor. तो ये हमने समझ लिया. अब ऐसे 610 ये बोलता है defines necessary work of effort to be carried out to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding the use of the work of internal audit function or internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate. तो ऐसे 610 आपको बोलता है it also defines the necessary work of it. तो आपको क्या क्या काम करना पड़ेगा to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate for the purpose of the audit. So it also defines the necessary work effort जो आपको काम करने पड़ेंगे to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate for the purposes of the audit. तो काम करते हैं अभी अपन फटाफट एक बार recap करते हैं आज हमने सुबह से क्या क्या लर्न किया है. तो मैंने बोला इंटरनल ऑडिट क्या होता है? इट्स अ फंक्शन ऑफ एन एंटिटी that is designed to provide assurance, that is designed to perform, that performs assurance and consultancy activities, ठीक है, and designed to evaluate and improve the entity's governance, entity's risk management and internal control processes. मैंने बोला it's the function of an entity, it's the function of an entity, you can say, that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management and internal control processes. फिर हम चले जाते हैं गवर्नेंस में। तो गवर्नेंस में क्या करना है इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन को? तो मैंने बोला इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन शुड असेस governance process with respect to the following parameters, with respect to the accomplishment of the following objective, that is ethics and values को क्या और governance entities governance will be able to promote, ठीक है, what is the, you can say, performance management and accountability, what is the level of communication of the risk and control to the appropriate area in the entity, and what is the effectiveness of the communication amongst the management, TCWG, external and internal auditors, ठीक है। Then risk management front, then the internal auditor would assist the entity in identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk. How can entity respond to this risk by applying the risk management framework and the internal controls, so contributing the improvement of the risk management and the internal control. And internal audit function also helps in the detection of the fraud. ये भी हमने पढ़ लिया। Then its objective is to also assess the, evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the internal control processes. So he will evaluate the internal control, he will review the controls, evaluate their operations and recommend some improvements, ठीक है। He will examine the financial and operating information that is considered by the management in their day-to-day decision making, and he will make specific inquiry into individual items, including detailed testing of transaction balances and procedures, ठीक है। He will review the operating activities, that is economy, efficiency and effectiveness of the operation. He will review the compliance with laws and regulations. So he will review the compliance with laws, regulation and other external requirements, including the management policies and directives, ठीक है। तो internal policy से भी देखिएगा whether they are in compliance to the internal policy and also with external policies, that is external laws and regulation. है ना। हाउ कैन वी यूज द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिटर? मैंने बोला यू कैन यूज द वर्क टू ऑब्टेन द इंफॉर्मेशन दैट इज रेलेवेंट फॉर योर रिस्क असेसमेंट, दैट इज यू कैन इंक्वायर अबाउट द इंटरनल ऑडिट पर्सनल, यू कैन टेक द इंफॉर्मेशन, तो हमने ऊपर पढ़ा था internal audit objective and scope also include the assessment, or you can say the identification of the risk, ठीक है, that is significant to the entity's operation, ठीक है, and identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk and then contributing to improvement of the risk management. So he can obtain the information that is relevant to the external auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement due to errors or fraud, and he can, unless prohibited by law or regulation or unless restricted by law or regulation, external auditor after appropriate evaluation may decide to use the work of the that has been performed by the internal audit function during the period in partial substitution for the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor. तो मैंने बोला in substitution of the audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor, or external auditor may think about using the work of internal audit function. So use the work of the internal audit function for audit evidence to be obtained directly by the external auditor, and unless prohibited or restricted to some extent by law or regulation, the external auditor may use internal auditors to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor, that is known as direct assistance, ठीक है। तो यूज इंटरनल ऑडिटर टू परफॉर्म ऑडिट प्रोसीजर, तो जो ऑडिट प्रोसीजर एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर खुद करता वो उससे परफॉर्म करा रहा है फ्रॉम द इंटरनल ऑडिटर अंडर द डायरेक्शन, सुपरविजन एंड रिव्यू ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर। अभी ऐसे 610 दो सिचुएशंस को कवर करता है। ऊपर वाली पहली सिचुएशन को नहीं कवर करता, दैट इज ऑब्टेनिंग इंफॉर्मेशन फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ रिस्क असेसमेंट, बिकॉज अल्टीमेटली रिस्क असेसमेंट में यू कांट इन्वॉल्व द रिस्क इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन। रिस्क असेसमेंट इज दी it is has to be done by the external it has to be done by the external auditor himself. He can only obtain information relevant for the purpose of the risk assessment. So ऐसे 610 क्या बोलता है स्टैंडर्ड ऑन ऑडिटिंग, ऐसे 610 ये बोलता है deals with the auditor's responsibility if using the work of the internal auditor. So you can use the work of internal auditors in two situations, when you are using the work of the internal auditor as an audit evidence. So using the work of internal audit function in obtaining audit evidence, and when you are using internal auditor to provide direct assistance under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor. There are two situations. मैंने बोला इस ऐसे में कहीं पे भी ये नहीं लिखा कि आपको मैंडेटरी यूज करना है इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन का वर्क. इट्स नॉट रिटन एनीवेयर एंड इट्स द सोल डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर. मतलब दिस ऐसे does not impose any you can say mandatory it does not say that it is mandatory for the external auditor to involve internal auditor, but it also it leaves on the discretion of the external auditor whether he wants to involve the internal auditor in either as the for the purpose of the performance of the audit procedures under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor, या फिर to evaluate the work that has been done by him as an audit evidence. So using the work of internal audit function in obtaining audit evidence. So what is the external auditor's responsibility for the audit? मैंने बोला external audit remains responsible for the audit. Even so, external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed, and it is not reduced. It is not responsibility is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide assistance. इसका कारण क्या है? Internal auditors are generally not independent of the entity, and therefore you can't heavily rely on their work, because ऐसे 200 क्या बोलता है, external auditor should be independent of the entity. But जो हम internal auditor होगा, जरूरी नहीं है कि या तो वो employee होगा. अगर employee है तो भाई वो independent पूरा हो ही नहीं सकता, कभी भी नहीं हो सकता, क्योंकि उसकी सैलरी वहां से आ रही है. ठीक है, तो he is not fully independent of the entity, and therefore ऐसे 610 क्या बोलता है, ऐसे 610 कुछ कंडीशन लगाता है necessary for the external auditor to use the work of the internal auditor. ये कंडीशन इसलिए जरूरी है ताकि आप ओवर यूज या अंडर यूज ना करो of the work of the internal audit. And as it, 610 also defines necessary work effort to be carried out. It also defines necessary work effort to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate for the purpose of the audit. So, it also requires some necessary procedures to be performed to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the work of the internal audit is sufficient, is adequate for the external auditors' purposes. So, external auditor has the sole responsibility. He has the sole responsibility for the expression of the audit opinion, and it is not reduced by the external auditors' use of the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So, दोनों ही केस में this responsibility is not reduced. So that is what we have covered as of today. Yeah. So now we are jumping on to a discussion that what is the objective of the external audit where the entity has an internal audit function. मतलब मान लो जिस entity में internal audit function है, what is the objective of the external auditor? ठीक है, तो ये सबसे important concept है, क्योंकि इसी से हमारे आगे के सारे answers बनेंगे. So the objective of the external auditor where the entity has an internal audit function, जहाँ पे entity का खुद का एक internal audit function है, and the external auditor expects to use the work of the function. So, and the auditor is expecting to use the work of the function, which will modify the nature, timing or extent rate of the audit procedure. मैंने बोला मेरे जो procedures होंगे शायद अब थोड़े कम हो जाए, because I am planning to use the work of the internal auditor. ठीक है, that has been already performed, है ना, to be performed direct, है ना. So it will reduce the nature, timing and extent of the audit procedure that would have been directly performed by the external auditor. But since it has been already performed by the internal auditor, so the auditor is considering the plan to use the work of the internal auditor to reduce the nature, timing and extent of the audit procedures to be directly performed by the auditor. या फिर I am planning to use internal auditor. To provide me direct assistance. तो मैंने बोला दो सिचुएशंस है जो हमने स्कोप ऑफ ऐसे 610 में भी पढ़ा था. ठीक है, तो मैंने बोला द ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर when the entity has internal audit function, external auditors and the external auditor expects to use the work of the function of the internal audit to modify the nature, timing and extent of the audit procedures to be performed directly by the external auditor, or to use internal auditor to provide direct assistance. Then these are the following objectives. Okay, so external auditor has to determine whether the work of the internal audit function or direct assistance. So whether the work of that function or the direct assistance. So there are two type of things that we have already discussed: using the work of the internal auditor or taking the help in directly performing the audit procedures on behalf of the external auditor, wherein the external auditor will direct, supervise and review. Okay, to determine whether the work of the internal audit function or direct assistance from internal auditors can be used. So सबसे पहले whether, the question is whether we can use internal audit. Then question is in which areas we can use internal audit and to what extent we can use internal audit. ठीक है, मैंने बोला सबसे पहला क्वेश्चन क्या है, whether we can use internal audit. अभी हम जब नीचे जाएंगे तो सबसे पहले क्वेश्चन का आंसर करेंगे whether we can use internal audit function. जब एंटिटी के पास internal audit function है तो क्या we can use internal audit function either as we can use the work of the internal audit function to modify the nature, timing and reduce the extent of our audit procedures that are to be performed directly by us. Can we consider whether we can use the work of the internal auditors or in which areas we can use the work of internal auditor and to what extent we can use. So auditor needs to determine. So the first objective of the external auditor when the entity has an internal audit function, तो उसको ये डिसाइड करना पड़ेगा कि क्या मैं यूज कर सकता हूँ इंटरनल ऑडिट के फंक्शन के वर्क का. ठीक है, टू डिटरमाइन वेदर द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, या मैं उन्हें डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस के रूप में यूज कर सकता हूँ. सो आई हैव टू डिटरमाइन whether the work of the internal audit function or direct assistance from internal auditors can be used. तो क्या मुझे सबसे पहले लिखना पड़ेगा whether I can use the work of the internal audit function or I can have the direct assistance from the internal auditors. So whether can I use it, ठीक है, and if so in which areas I should use it and to what extent I should use it, है ना. And having made that determination, then I should determine if using the work of the internal audit function means I am using the work of the internal audit function that has already been done by them. ठीक है, so I am using the work of the internal audit function to determine whether that work is adequate. तो मुझे देखना है whether that work is adequate for the purposes of my audit, for the purpose of the external audit. And if using internal auditors to provide direct assistance, then I should direct, supervise and review their work. ठीक है, इसके लिए हमने नीचे बहुत अच्छा सा एक फ्लो चार्ट बनाया है. So the objective of the external auditor, है ना, when the entity has an internal audit function is first external auditor should determine whether he expects to use the work of the function. So to decide whether he wants to he expects to use the work. So the point is the objective of the external auditor where the entity has an internal audit function and the external auditor expects to use the work of the function to modify the nature, timing, extent of the audit procedures to be performed directly by the external auditor, या फिर to use internal auditors to provide direct assistance. He should determine whether the work can be used, in what areas work can be used, in which areas and to what extent work can be used. Then using the work of internal audit function, then when he's using the work of the internal audit function, then he should determine that the work is adequate for the purpose of the audit. When he's basically considering the use of the internal audit function, he should consider that the work is adequate for the purpose of audit. And when using internal auditor for the direct assistance, है ना, जब वो direct assistance के रूप में use कर रहा है internal auditor को, तो he should direct, supervise and review their work. तो मैंने बोला objective of external auditor क्या है, तो मैंने बोला we can use. देखो सबसे पहले हमने flow of standard कहाँ से start किया. ठीक है, हमने बोला सबसे पहले एक auditor, a way in which the external auditor may make use of the internal audit function for the purposes of the audit. तो वो he can obtain information for the purpose of risk assessment. He can use the work of the internal audit for audit evidences. Okay, he can use the work of internal audit for audit evidences, and he can use internal auditor to perform audit procedures, under direction, supervision of the and review of the external auditor. So he can use the internal auditor in 3 ways. Okay, अभी आप समझो SA 610 covers only 2 situations, that is using the work of the internal audit function to obtain audit evidence and using the internal auditors to provide direct assistance under the direction, supervision and review of the external auditor. फिर हमने पढ़ा external auditor's responsibility. He is solely responsible for the audit opinion expressed, and that responsibility is not reduced by way of involvement of the internal audit. That responsibility is not reduced by the external auditor's use of the work of the internal audit. है ना। इसका रीजन हमने समझा, इंटरनल ऑडिटर मे नॉट बी फुल्ली इंडिपेंडेंट ऑफ द एंटिटी। तो चाहे वो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन हो, चाहे वो सेपरेटली इंटरनल ऑडिटर एक थर्ड पार्टी हो, दे माइट बी सब्जेक्ट टू सम इन्फ्लुएंस, है ना। ऐसे 610 defines conditions which are necessary for external auditor to view the work of internal auditor. So it defines some conditions which are necessary for the external auditor to evaluate if he wants to use the work of internal auditor. तो जो हमने नीचे ऑब्जेक्टिव ये वाला पॉइंट पढ़ेंगे ना, पॉइंट नंबर बी, तो यहाँ पे हमें देखना पड़ेगा। तो मैंने बोला if the objective of the external auditor, जहाँ पे एक एंटिटी के पास इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन है and the external auditor expects to use the work of the audit of the internal audit function to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures. That is to reduce the extent of the audit procedures to be performed directly by the external auditor. So he's reducing his procedures that are to be performed directly by him by leveraging the work that has already been performed by the internal auditors, or to use internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So he has to determine whether he can use he has to determine whether the work of the internal audit function or the direct assistance from internal auditors can be used. So whether I can use the work of internal auditor or not. That is the first question that I need to address. Then second question, in which areas and to what extent I can use. And having made that determination, so once I have determined that I can use the work of the internal auditor, in which areas I have decided and to what extent I have decided, then I should move on to the second step. If using the work of the internal audit function to determine whether the work is adequate, whether the work performed is adequate for the purposes of the audit, and if using internal auditors to provide direct assistance, then you should direct, supervise, and review their work. To appropriately direct, supervise, and review their work. तो हमने ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर को अच्छे से समझा। मैंने बोला जब एक एंटिटी के पास एक इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन है एंड एक्सटर्नल एंड ठीक है, एक एंटिटी के पास इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन है और दूसरा एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर चाहता है, expects to use the work of that function to reduce, or you can say to determine, to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedure to be performed directly by the external auditor, या फिर to use internal auditors to provide direct assistance. Then he should determine whether the work can be used, क्या वो work को use कर सकता है, in which areas and to what extent. And then using the work of the internal audit function, he should consider that the work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. And when taking direct assistance, using internal auditors, using internal auditor for the to provide direct assistance to appropriately direct, supervise, and review their work. So external auditor has to direct, supervise, and review their work. ठीक है, अभी हमने सबसे पहला पॉइंट क्या पढ़ा था? The objective of the auditor is to determine whether work can be used or not. So when determining, so this point is this: evaluating the internal audit function. So the first objective, that is whether we can use the work of internal audit or not, in itself is a question. ठीक है, तो अभी it depends on the following factors. So the first objective of the external auditor to determine whether the work of the internal auditor can be used. तो हम इस वाले पॉइंट की बात कर रहे हैं, determine whether the work can be used. तो हम इस वाले पॉइंट पे जा रहे हैं और हम लर्न कर रहे हैं कि the external auditor shall determine whether the work of the internal audit function can be used for the purposes of the audit by evaluating the following things. ठीक है, he has to evaluate the level of competence of the internal audit function. He has to evaluate the level of competence of the internal audit function. He has to evaluate the internal audit function's organizational status. मतलब क्या what is the organizational status? तो क्या वो sufficiently independent है? ठीक है, तो what is the extent of the organizational status and the relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditors. तो यहाँ पे हमने, आपको याद होगा जब हमने मैनेजमेंट एक्सपर्ट का पॉइंट पढ़ा था, तो एक काम करते हैं, वापस से रिवाइज करते हैं मैनेजमेंट एक्सपर्ट का पॉइंट। जहाँ पे हमने पढ़ा था, you have to obtain an evidence as to the competence, capability, and objectivity. ठीक है, then you have to understand the work of the management expert, correct, and then you have to also consider the appropriateness of that expert work as an audit evidence for the relevant assertion. ठीक है, तो ये हमने 3 पॉइंट्स पढ़े थे। तो we have to evaluate the competence, capability, and objectivity. हमें देखना है competence, capability, and objectivity. You have to obtain an understanding of the work of that expert, and you have to evaluate the appropriateness of that expert work as audit evidence for the relevant assertion. So हमने ये पढ़ा था competence, capability, and objectivity. तो similar basis पे आपको जब internal audit function को आप evaluate कर रहे हो, evaluate means you are determining whether I can use the work of internal audit or not. you will consider the objectivity, what is the organizational status, and what are the relevant policies and procedures that support the objectivity of the internal auditors. So the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity. So competence, capability, and objectivity. तो इधर सारे पॉइंट कैसे बनेंगे, तो यू हैव टू कंसिडर द ऑब्जेक्टिविटी ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर. अगर वो बंदा इंडिपेंडेंट है of the entity, then you can think about using the work of the internal audit function. What is the level of competence of the internal audit function? कितने वो knowledgeable है, and whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control. तो क्या वो एक systematic and disciplined approach लगाते हैं to audit, like first of all assessing the risk, then determining what programs or what procedures they need to perform. Whether we apply a systematic and disciplined approach, including the quality control. Quality control means that someone reviews the work of the team, of the internal audit team, that has been performed with respect to the quality, that the procedures performed, the risk identified are appropriate by the internal auditor persona. Okay. So हमने बोला when evaluating, determining whether we can use the work, ठीक है, whether we can use the work of internal audit or not. तो हमने बोला हमें तीन फैक्टर्स कंसिडर करने हैं. You have to consider what is the organizational status, the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor. Objectivity को कितना support करते हैं? What is the level of competence of the internal audit function? कितने competent लोग हैं? And then whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control. तो हमने सबसे पहले पढ़ा objectives of the internal auditor, external auditor, sorry, ठीक है. What are the objectives of the external auditor? तो जहाँ पे एक एंटिटी के पास इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन है एंड एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर ने डिटरमाइन किया है टू यूज द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर टू मॉडिफाई द नेचर, टाइमिंग एंड एक्सटेंट ऑफ द प्रोसीजर्स that are to be directly performed by the external auditor, या फिर to use internal auditors to provide direct assistance, then he should, in these cases, prior to using the work, he should consider the following things, that to determine whether he can use the work, then in which areas he can use, and to what extent he can use the work of internal audit function. Then you also need to consider whether the using the work of the internal audit function is adequate for the purposes of audit. That is the this point. That is when we are using the work of the function, internal audit function, for the purpose of as an audit evidence. So whether it is appropriate, it is adequate for the purposes of the audit. And when I am directly taking the direct assistance of the internal auditor, then I should direct, supervise, and review their work. Okay. So using internal auditor to perform as a direct assistance, he should direct, supervise, and review. अभी हमने बोला कि क्या हम whether we can use. So we are talking about the first objective and the first part, that is whether we can use the work of internal audit or not. Now in the next part we will answer in which areas and to what extent. ठीक है. तो अभी हम जो आंसर कर रहे हैं, that is whether we can use the work of internal audit or not. So it depends on the following factors. ठीक है. It depends on the following factors. तो मैंने बोला the extent to which internal audit functions, organizational status, and the policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor, the level of competence of the internal audit function, and whether the internal audit functions applies a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control. अभी हमने बोला ऑब्जेक्टिविटी का इवैल्यूएशन करना पड़ेगा, आपको कॉम्पिटेंस का इवैल्यूएशन करना पड़ेगा, और आपको देखना पड़ेगा क्या इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन्ड अप्रोच लगाता है या नहीं लगाता. तो तीन पॉइंट्स की बात कर रहे हैं जिसके बेसिस पे हम डिटरमाइन करेंगे वेदर टू यूज द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन और नॉट. तो वेदर टू यूज द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन या फिर वेदर टू यूज द डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस. तो यूजिंग द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिटर एज एन ऑडिट एविडेंस to reduce the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedure that are to be performed directly by the external auditor, or to determine whether we should use direct assistance. ठीक है. तो आप समझो डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस क्या हुआ, जहां पे बेसिकली आई एम गाइडिंग देम कि ये प्रोसीजर परफॉर्म करो, ऐसे परफॉर्म करो. तो मैंने बोला पीपी में सबसे पहले मैंने सैंपल निकाले और मैंने उन्हें भेज दिया कि भाई आपको क्या करना है. सबसे पहले पीपी के लिए आपको सबसे पहले देखना परचेज ऑर्डर रेज किया है, वेंडर से 2 कोटेशन मंगवाई है. तो यहाँ पे कोई भी जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व नहीं है और इसमें सिर्फ और सिर्फ प्लेन टेस्टिंग है. सो आई कैन थिंक ऑफ यूजिंग देम एज अ डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस या फिर हो सकता है कि उन्होंने खुद काम कर रखा हो, दे हैव ऑलरेडी असेस्ड द रिस्क, दे हैव ऑलरेडी कंसिडर्ड, ऑल्दो देखो वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट, you can't leverage the risk assessment of the internal auditor. You have to independently assess the risk. Risk assessment cannot be given to the internal auditor or you can't rely on it. अभी जब हम आगे बढ़ेंगे ना इन व्हाट एरियाज, तो वहां पे पॉइंट आएगा, ठीक है। तो एक काम करते हैं, अभी अपन सबसे पहले समझते हैं वेदर वी कैन यूज। तो मैंने बोला उसके लिए अगर हमें यूज करना है हम कर सकते हैं यूज, अगर internal auditor is objective, he is competent and he follows a systematic and disciplined approach including quality control. So objectivity refers to the ability to perform. So I am able to perform my task without allowing my biasness, conflict of interest or undue influence of others to override the professional judgment. So मैंने बोला objectivity refers to the ability to perform task without biasness, conflict of interest or undue influence. So it reflects the ability to perform task without biasness, कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट और अनड्यू इन्फ्लुएंस। तो मतलब मैं किसी की प्रति बायस नहीं हूँ, ठीक है, मेरे पे किसी का दबाव नहीं है, आई डोंट हैव एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट, है ना, टू ओवरराइड माय प्रोफेशनल जजमेंट। तो मैंने बोला इट रेफर्स टू द एबिलिटी टू परफॉर्म टास्क without any biasness, conflict of interest or undue influence of others to override my professional judgment, to override my professional judgment. So factors that may external auditors evaluation in carrying out the objectivity. तो अभी मुझे ये देखना है कि क्या और तो मैंने सबसे पहले क्या पढ़ा था, whether the organizational status and policies and procedures, हमने जब ये लैंग्वेज पढ़ी थी, सो वेदर द एक्सटेंट टू विच द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शंस, ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल स्टेटस एंड रेलेवेंट पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोसीजर्स सपोर्ट द ऑब्जेक्टिविटी ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स, ठीक है। तो ये पॉइंट था। तो वी हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड whether the organizational status, what is the organizational status of the internal audit function, including the functions, authority and accountability, वो किसको रिपोर्ट करते हैं, क्या वो टीसीडब्ल्यूजी को रिपोर्ट करते हैं। अगर वो टीसीडब्ल्यूजी के लिए अकाउंटेबल है तो ऑब्वियसली बात है वो ज्यादा इंडिपेंडेंट होंगे, क्योंकि टीसीडब्ल्यूजी में कौन बैठे हैं, इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर्स। अगर वो मैनेजमेंट के रिपोर्ट करते हैं तो शायद वो कम इंडिपेंडेंट हो, ठीक है। इंक्लूडिंग द फंक्शंस, अथॉरिटी एंड अकाउंटेबिलिटी सपोर्ट्स द एबिलिटी ऑफ द फंक्शन to be free from biasness, conflict of interest or undue influence of others to override professional judgment. So whether the organizational status, मतलब what is the organizational status, किसको वो रिपोर्ट करते हैं, अकाउंटेबिलिटी क्या है, and what is their authority. So whether the organizational status of the internal audit function, including the functions, authority, क्या क्या वो actions ले सकते हैं, and to whom they are accountable, it supports the ability of the function to be free from biasness, conflict of interest or undue influence. तो मैंने बोला objectivity refers to the ability to perform those tasks without biasness, undue influence or conflict of interest of others to override my professional judgment, ठीक है। Factors that may affect external auditors evaluation in relation to objectivity includes the following. मैंने बोला बहुत सिंपल सी बात है, when I am considering, तो सबसे पहले हमने क्या पढ़ा था, so whether we can use the work of internal audit function or not, then you should consider the extent to which the internal audit functions, organizational status and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor. And objectivity क्या होता है, it refers to the ability to perform task without any biasness, मतलब बिना किसी you can say favorism, without any biasness, conflict of interest or undue influence, it do not override the professional judgment. तो हमें ये समझना पड़ेगा how the organizational status of the internal audit function, including the functions, authority and accountability. Authority means क्या क्या actions ले सकती है वो। अगर मान लो कोई controls में दिक्कत लगी तो क्या वो controls को improve करने के लिए measures ले सकती है। What is the functions, authority and to whom it is accountable. अगर वो accountable है TCWG को तो basically that supports the independence of the internal audit function, क्योंकि TCWG is also an independent functionality, ठीक है। Whether the internal audit functions reports to TCWG or an officer with appropriate authority, जिसके पास appropriate authority है, और if the functions reports to management, whether it has direct access to TCWG. तो मान लो अगर मैं report करता हूँ management को, but in situations if required, can I directly approach to TCWG? Because हमने जब रिलायंस की एनुअल रिपोर्ट पढ़ी थी तो हमने देखा था इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर्स फॉर्म्स दो चार्ज विद गवर्नेंस, दैट इज ऑडिट कमेटी। तो क्या मैं ऑडिट कमेटी को डायरेक्टली अप्रोच कर सकता हूं? तो फैक्टर्स दैट मे अफेक्ट द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर्स इवैल्यूएशन इन रिलेशन टू ऑब्जेक्टिविटी इंक्लूड द फॉलोइंग। तो इंटरनल ऑडिट का क्या और वेदर द ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल स्टेटस ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इंक्लूडिंग द फंक्शन अथॉरिटी एंड अकाउंटेबिलिटी सपोर्ट्स द एबिलिटी ऑफ द फंक्शन टू बी फ्री फ्रॉम बायस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट undue influence of others to override professional judgment। क्या टीसीडब्ल्यूजी ओवरसी करता है, ठीक है, एम्प्लॉयमेंट डिसीजन रिलेटिंग टू द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन। तो whether the TCWG oversee the employment decision related to the internal audit function। तो क्या those charged with governance see the employment decision, उनकी रेम्यूनरेशन कैसे कौन डिसाइड करता है? ऑब्वियसली बात है, अगर इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर्स डिसाइड करते हैं तो दैट इज मोर हेल्पफुल। सो वेदर टीसीडब्ल्यूजी ओवरसी द एम्प्लॉयमेंट डिसीजन रिलेटेड टू द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन। अगर मैनेजमेंट करता है तो हो सकता है कि मैनेजमेंट उन्हें बोले कि भाई साहब मैं तुम्हारी सैलरी बढ़ा दूंगा, बस तुम ये चीज रिपोर्ट मत करना, इससे क्या होगा, कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट आ जाएगा, ठीक है। सो वेदर टीसीडब्ल्यूजी ओवरसी द एम्प्लॉयमेंट डिसीजन रिलेटेड टू द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन एंड वेदर देयर आर एनी कॉन्स्टेंट्स और रेस्ट्रिक्शंस। तो क्या कोई कांस्टेंट या रेस्ट्रिक्शन तो नहीं है ऑन द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन बाय मैनेजमेंट या टीसीडब्ल्यूजी से? फॉर एग्जांपल कुछ कांस्टेंट या रेस्ट्रिक्शन तो नहीं है। फॉर एग्जांपल क्या है, बहुत अच्छा एग्जांपल है कि क्या इंटरनल ऑडिटर फ्रीली बात कर सकता है एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर के साथ, फॉर एग्जांपल, या फिर मैनेजमेंट ने रेस्ट्रिक्शन लगा रखी है, टीसीडब्ल्यूजी ने रेस्ट्रिक्शन लगा रखी है। अगर रेस्ट्रिक्शन लगा रखी है तो इट इंप्लाइज दैट दे आर नॉट ऑब्जेक्टिव, दैट इज इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज नॉट ऑब्जेक्टिव, दैट इज इट इज नॉट फ्री फ्रॉम बायस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट और undue influence of others। So whether the internal audit function, yeah. So basically the question is whether there are any constraints or restriction placed on the internal audit function by management or TCWG. For example, in communicating the internal audit function findings to the external auditor. तो क्या internal auditor अपनी फाइंडिंग्स बता सकता है टू द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर? देन वेदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज, ठीक है। इसका मतलब क्या है, अगर मान लो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन खुद ही कंट्रोल ओनर है, खुद ही कंट्रोल ओनर है, तो इसका मतलब क्या है, वो खुद ही कंट्रोल परफॉर्म कर रहा है, तो क्या वो शायद उस पर इंडिपेंडेंट ओपिनियन दे पाएगा? तो जवाब है नहीं, बिकॉज ये कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट। तो वेदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज। तो मान लो एक कंट्रोल है जिसमें बीआरएस बंदा रिव्यू करता है, ठीक है, तो अभी जो इंटरनल ऑडिट वाला बंदा है वो खुद ही बीआरएस रिव्यू करता है, तो जब वो इस कंट्रोल को देखने जाएगा तो देयर विल बी अ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी। सो वेदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी, फॉर एग्जांपल हैविंग मैनेजरियल और ऑपरेशनल ड्यूटीज और रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज that are outside of the internal audit function। तो अगर मान लो उसके पास मैनेजरियल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज भी है, यू कैन से ऑपरेशनल ड्यूटीज भी है या फिर रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है, तो अगर दैट माइट बी द केस दैट ही माइट नॉट बी फुली इंडिपेंडेंट, ही माइट नॉट बी फुली इंडिपेंडेंट। तो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी मैंने क्या बोला, सबसे पहले व्हाट इज द ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर? तो सबसे पहले उसका ऑब्जेक्टिव तीन चीजों में था कि वेदर ही कैन यूज द वर्क, वेदर इंटरनल ऑडिट कैन बी यूज्ड, in what areas it can be used and to what extent it can be used. Then he has to use the work of the internal audit function. He has to evaluate before using the work of that internal audit function. He has to evaluate whether the work is adequate for his purposes. And when using the direct assistance, he should direct, supervise, and review the work of the internal audit function. तो ये हमने समझा था, करेक्ट। फिर जब हमने समझा कि whether the work of the internal audit function can be used, तो हमने देखा how organizational status and policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal audit function. Then we consider whether the internal audit function is sufficiently competent and the level of competence of the internal audit function. The first point was the extent to which the internal audit functions organizational status and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditors, and whether the internal auditors audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach to the internal audit, including quality control. Abhi, what is the objectivity and its evaluation? So auditor has to evaluate क्या ऑब्जेक्टिव है इंटरनल ऑडिट डिपार्टमेंट, तो इसके लिए वो क्या देखेगा? इट रेफर्स टू द एबिलिटी to perform task without the biasness, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others, which might override the professional judgment. ठीक है? And what are the factors that are considered to be relevant? So whether the factors that may affect the external auditors evaluation in relation to objectivity includes the following. These are the factors that needs to be considered. तो अभी क्या क्या factors है? मैंने बोला क्या organizational status of the entity, internal audit function, ठीक है, whether the organizational status of the internal audit function, that is its authority and its accountability. To whom it is accountable? Okay, its authority and accountability supports the ability of the function to be free from bias, conflict of interest. So what is the organizational status of the internal audit function? That is its authority and accountability. क्या क्या authority है? अगर कुछ उसे control में दिक्कत मिलती है तो वो क्या क्या action ले सकता है? And to whom it is accountable? अगर वो accountable है independent directors को, तो that is considered to be much more helpful. अगर वो management को भी accountable है तो चल जाएगा, but they should always have direct access to TCWG. ठीक है? And we have to consider whether the TCWG oversee the employment decisions related to the internal audit function. तो क्या TCWG oversee करता है employment decisions, that is what remuneration should be paid to the internal audit function. अगर मान लो यहाँ पे अगर मैनेजमेंट डिसाइड करता है तो मैनेजमेंट शायद बोल सकता है कि भाई तू मेरी गलती छोड़ दे, बायसनेस ला सकता है, कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट ला सकता है, मैं तेरी सैलरी बढ़ा दूंगा. सो वेदर TCWG oversee the employment decision and whether there are any constraints or restrictions based on the internal audit function. कि जैसे एग्जांपल ले लो, इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन कैन नॉट communicate its finding to the external auditors. तो अगर कुछ ऐसा restriction या फिर you can say constant placed है on the internal audit function by the management or TCWG, for example in communicating the internal audit function's finding to the external auditor, and whether the internal audit function is free of any conflicting responsibilities, for example management responsibilities या फिर operational duties या responsibility that are outside of the internal audit function, तो he is free from conflicting responsibilities. Then comes the competence and then comes the application of a systematic and disciplined approach. एक काम करते हैं पहले हम चलो एक काम करते हैं पहले competence को cover करते हैं and also application of systematic and disciplined approach. Then we will learn it through and revise it through once again through the flow chart. अभी competence क्या mean होता है? Competence means the attainment and maintenance of knowledge and skill. So attain की हुई है and maintain कर रहा है वो, ठीक है? तो मान लो मैंने CAT डिग्री अटेन करी, लेकिन क्या मैं इसे मेंटेन कर पा रहा हूँ? मतलब आई एम अपडेटिंग माय नॉलेज एज एंड व्हेन देयर इज अपडेट्स इन द टैक्स लॉज. And so competence does not mean only attainment of knowledge, but it also means attainment and maintenance of the knowledge and skill. So competence of the internal audit function refers to the attainment. मैंने ज्ञान दिया and उसको मैं maintain करते जा रहा हूँ. Let's suppose GST में law change हुआ तो I am maintaining that updates. ठीक है? It refers to the attainment and maintenance of knowledge and skills of the function as a whole. At the level required to enable assigned tasks to be performed diligently, ताकि assigned task जो उसे मिला है he can perform it diligently and in accordance with the applicable professional standard. तो मैंने बोला internal auditor should attain and maintain a knowledge level and a skill level of the function as a whole at the level required to enable assigned tasks to be performed diligently, ताकि task diligently perform हो जाए and in accordance with the professional standard. तो मैंने बोला you have to attain and maintain knowledge and skill, ठीक है, ताकि जो असाइन टास्क है वो diligently परफॉर्म हो जाए and in accordance with the applicable professional standard. Factors that may affect the external auditor's determination in relation to competence include the following. तो क्या internal audit function competent है या नहीं है? It depends on the following: whether the internal audit function is adequately and appropriately resourced. क्या उनके पास sufficient बंदे हैं, जितना काम है is adequately resourced relative to the size of the entity and the nature of its operation. मैंने बोला considering the size of the entity and considering the nature of its operation, whether the internal audit function is sufficiently and adequately resourced. So whether the internal audit function, क्या internal audit function is adequately and appropriately resourced, consider करो आप size of the entity and the nature of its operation. Whether there are established policies, क्या policies exist करती है for hiring, training and assigning. तो मैंने बोला हायरिंग की पॉलिसी मतलब हम सिर्फ सीए को हायर करेंगे इन द इंटरनल ऑडिट डिपार्टमेंट. तो whether there exist any established policies for hiring, फिर हम उन्हें ट्रेनिंग देंगे पूरे दिन 3-4 हफ्ते लगातार कंट्रोल्स की, रिस्क की, इन सब की ट्रेनिंग देंगे and through practical as an example. And assigning internal auditors to internal audit engagement. अब जो बंदे हायर हो चुके हैं, जो बंदे ट्रेन हो चुके हैं, उनको हम असाइन करेंगे. So whether there are established policies for hiring, training and assigning internal auditors to the internal audit engagements, and whether the internal auditors have adequate technical training and proficiency in auditing. क्या उनको sufficient training मिली है, technical training है, and they are proficient in auditing. ठीक है? So whether the internal auditors have adequate technical training and proficiency in auditing, and whether the internal auditors possess the required knowledge. क्या उनके पास required knowledge है relating to the entity's financial reporting, क्योंकि वो फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग के बारे में पता है एंड द एप्लीकेबल फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग फ्रेमवर्क के बारे में पता है। तो देयर आर 4 points to competence. Competence means attainment and maintenance of skill. Competence of an internal audit function refers to the attainment and maintenance of the knowledge and skill at the level required to enable assigned tasks to be performed diligently and in accordance with the professional standards. What are the factors that can affect the external auditor's determination in relation to competence include whether the internal auditing function is sufficiently resourced considering the size of the entity and the nature of its operation. What is the whether there are established policies around the hiring, then you can say training and assignment. So whether there are established policies for hiring, training and assigning internal auditors to the internal audit engagement, and internal auditors have adequately had adequate technical training and proficiency in auditing. तो क्या उन्हें ट्रेनिंग दी जा रही है? They are technically trained and they are also proficient in auditing. मतलब उन्हें pivot table से कैसे analyze करना data वो सब आता है. They are technically trained and are proficient in auditing, and they also have knowledge of the financial reporting of the company and the applicable FR. So internal auditors possess the required knowledge relating to the entity's financial reporting and the applicable FRF, that is financial reporting framework. So these are the points relating to the competence. So मैंने बोला whether to use the work of the internal audit function or not, it depends on how the entity's organizational status and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor, the extent to which the internal audit functions organizational status and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor, what is the level of competence of the internal audit function, and whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach. ये फैक्टर्स मैं कंसिडर करूंगा प्रायर टू डिटरमाइन वेदर आई कैन यूज द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट और नॉट। मैंने बोला क्या वो कॉम्पिटेंट है, क्या वो ऑब्जेक्टिव है एंड क्या वो सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन्ड अप्रोच लगाता है काम करने के लिए। ये फैक्टर्स मैं कंसिडर करूंगा प्रायर टू यूजिंग द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन। ठीक है, प्रायर टू यूजिंग द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन। सो व्हेन डिटरमाइनिंग द यूज ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, ये आपको 3 फैक्टर्स कंसिडर करने हैं। अभी ऑब्जेक्टिविटी के लिए, ऑब्जेक्टिविटी का मतलब क्या होता है? इट रेफर्स टू द एबिलिटी टू परफॉर्म टास्क without the biasness, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others, and undue influence of others to override my professional judgment. What are the factors that impact objectivity that may affect the external auditor's evaluation in relation to objectivity? Include the following. तो क्या मेरी ऑब्जेक्टिविटी इम्पैक्ट होगी या नहीं होगी? तो what are the factors that may affect the external auditor's objectivity in external auditor's evaluation in relation to objectivity? Include the following. कि क्या organizational status है of the internal audit function, मतलब what is its authority, what is its accountability. अगर मैंने बोला accountability है to TCWG directly, so then it's more you can say independent. ठीक है, that is more objective. It supports the functioning of the department to be free from bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence. So what is the whether the organizational status of the internal audit function, that is including the functions authority and accountability, supports the ability of the function to be free from bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override the professional judgment. ठीक है, and whether TCWG oversee the employment decisions relating to the internal audit function. तो क्या independent directors ही employment decision लेते हैं? क्योंकि शायद अगर मैनेजमेंट लेगा तो वो हो सकता है कि मैनेजमेंट की बायस आ जाए और मैनेजमेंट ये बोल दे कि भाई मैं तेरी रेम्यूनरेशन बढ़ा दूंगा, तो बस ये पॉइंट या ये फाइंडिंग को निकाल दो। ठीक है, तो whether TCWG oversee the employment decision related to the internal audit function, and whether there are any constraints or restriction, क्या कुछ कांस्टेंट है या फिर रेस्ट्रिक्शन है ऑन द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन बाय द मैनेजमेंट और टीसीडब्ल्यूजी, जैसे कि क्या वो टीसीडब्ल्यूजी या मैनेजमेंट मना करते हैं इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन को टू डायरेक्टली कम्युनिकेट द फाइंडिंग्स टू द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर. सो इन कम्युनिकेटिंग द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन फाइंडिंग्स टू द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर, सो वेदर देयर आर एनी कंस्ट्रेंट्स और रेस्ट्रिक्शन एंड वेदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पांसिबिलिटीज. तो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन के पास कोई भी मैनेजरियल रोल नहीं है या फिर कोई भी ऑपरेशनल रोल नहीं है. अगर ऐसा होगा तो ही माइट बी कॉन्फ्लिक्टेड. तो मान लो अगर आपको उसको बीआरएस का कंट्रोल ही इवैल्यूएट करना है लेकिन वो खुद ही बीआरएस बना रहा है, तो ही माइट हैव कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट. तो वेदर द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन इज फ्री ऑफ एनी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग रिस्पांसिबिलिटीज. तो हमने 4 पॉइंट्स पढ़े, देन कॉम्पिटेंस एंड इवैल्यूएशन किया, and now we are moving to approach application of a systematic and disciplined approach. So इसका मतलब क्या है? क्या जो इंटरनल ऑडिटर है, ठीक है, they have a plan, they plan the audit, they perform the audit, they supervise it, they review it, and document it. So are there any policies or procedures for planning the audit, then performing it, then supervising it, and reviewing it, and then documenting it? ठीक है? So the application of a systematic and disciplined approach to planning, performing, supervision, review, and documentation, and documenting its activities distinguishes the activities of the internal audit function. That अभी हमने पढ़ा था ना, monitoring internal control can be through ongoing activities, and through separate evaluations. अभी हमने पढ़ा था separate evaluations are generally conducted by the internal audit function. So what is the difference between the separate evaluation and the ongoing activities? Is that separate evaluations are basically planned, performed, supervised, reviews, and documented. Okay, so that's the difference of the internal audit function from the other monitoring control activities like ongoing monitoring. Okay, that may be performed within the entity. So मैंने बोला the point here is internal audit functions differ from the other monitoring activities that is performed by the entity in a way that it is planned, performed, supervised, reviewed, and documented. So whether the internal audit function follows a systematic and disciplined approach to executing the internal audit is the question that is involved here. Okay? So what are the factors that may affect the external auditor's determination of whether the internal audit function applies the systematic and disciplined approach includes the following? Okay, what is the existence, adequacy, and use of the documented internal audit procedures or guidance? So what is the whether the internal audit procedures or guidance do exist? तो सबसे पहला क्वेश्चन है क्या वो exist करती है, क्या वो adequate है, and how we are using it. So existence, adequacy, and use of the documented internal audit procedures or guidance covering such areas as risk assessment, risk कैसे assess करना है, then how you need to define the work program, then how you need to document and report the findings, and what is the nature and extent of documentation and reporting, and then you need to evaluate that the nature and extent is commensurate with the size and circumstances of an entity. मैंने बोला whether there are internal audit policies, procedures, or guidance. Okay, policy, procedures, or guidance that so the existence, adequacy, and use of documented internal audit procedures or guidance covering such areas as risk assessment, then work programs, documentation and reporting, and the nature and extent of the risk assessment, work programs, documentation, and reporting is commensurate with the size and circumstances of an entity. So risk assessment, work programs, documentation, and reporting is the nature and extent of which is commensurate with the size and circumstances of an entity. तो जो policies and procedures बने हैं या जो guidance बने हैं that support the risk assessment, work program, documentation, and reporting. So internal policies, guidance, procedures, these are you can say is commensurate with the size of the entity. So क्या policies and procedures are commensurate with the size and circumstances of an entity, and whether the internal audit function has appropriate quality control policies and procedures. तो क्या quality control होता है, जैसे SQC1 होता है या SA 220, ठीक है? तो जैसे एक्सटर्नल ऑडिट के लिए क्वालिटी कंट्रोल की पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोसीजर्स है, जैसे EQCR कराना पड़ता है, ठीक है? मैंने बोला मैंडेटरी मतलब बोला था क्वालिटी कंट्रोल प्रोसीजर्स that has been set up as part of the internal audit function. So application of a systematic and disciplined approach. अब एक काम करते हैं, तीनों पॉइंट्स को समझते हैं. Whether we can use the work of internal auditor or not, ठीक है? Whether we can use the work of internal auditor or not depends on three factors, that is objectivity, competence, and application of a systematic and disciplined approach. Objectivity means it refers to the ability to perform tasks without getting influenced by any biasness, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others. Then comes the competence. It is attainment and maintenance of a knowledge and skill level, okay, necessary to perform the task diligently and in accordance with the applicable professional standard. Then application of a systematic and disciplined approach means that the approach to planning, performing, supervising, review, and documenting is appropriate. ठीक है? तो मैंने बोला there is a plan, the application of a systematic and disciplined approach to planning, performing, supervising, review, and documentation. Its activity distinguishes the activity of internal audit function from the other monitoring control activities. ठीक है? फिर हमने बात करी objectivity की. तो objectivity में क्या-क्या factors है that might impact objectivity. मैंने बोला what is the organizational status, अकाउंटेबिलिटी किसको है एंड अथॉरिटी किसके पास है ना, ताकि फंक्शन अथॉरिटी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन स्टेटस ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन टू whom the authority has been given and to whom the function is accountable, that would ensure that it is free from bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others who decide the employment decisions for the internal audit function, whether there are any constraints or restrictions on the internal audit function, that they cannot directly communicate their findings with the external auditor, and whether the internal audit function is free of any conflicting responsibilities. Example, उन्हीं के पास managerial responsibility को नहीं दे रखी, उन्हीं के पास तो आपने operational responsibility को नहीं दे रखी. So you have to consider these things. Then competencies and its evaluation, and then you have to apply systematic and disciplined approach. ठीक है? So competence and its evaluation means, है ना, competence of an internal audit function. Competence of an internal audit function refers to the, yeah. So competence of an internal audit function refers to the attainment and maintenance of a knowledge and skill level at the level required to enable assigned tasks to be performed diligently and in accordance with the applicable professional standards. What are the factors that you need to consider? We need to consider whether the department is sufficiently resourced in consideration of the size of the entity and the nature of its operation, whether there are established policies for hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors to the internal audit engagements, and whether the internal auditors have technical trainings and proficiency in auditing the stuffs, and internal auditors possess the required knowledge relating to the entity's financial reporting and the applicable FRF. So they have knowledge of the financial reporting and the applicable FRF. Then application of a systematic and disciplined approach. जिसमें हमने समझा application of a systematic and disciplined approach means that the internal audit department's plans its work, perform supervision, review, and document. So that differentiates internal audit function from the other components of the monitoring of control activity of the internal control. है ना? तो एक component था ना monitoring of control. There are two parts, that is ongoing activities and separate evaluation. Separate evaluations are generally done by internal audit function. So planning, performing, supervision, review, and documenting is what differentiate internal audit function from the other ongoing activities performed as part of the monitoring of the control activity. Okay. So what is the factors that may affect the external auditor's determination of whether the internal auditor function has a systematic and disciplined approach? तो इसके लिए मैं देख सकता हूँ what are the internal audit procedures, what are the whether there are any documented internal audit procedures or guidance. So the existence, whether do they exist, whether they are adequate, and what is the use, whether the personals are actually using it. So what is the existence, adequacy, and use of the documented internal audit procedures or guidance, covering such as areas as risk assessments. So सबसे पहले risk assessment, then what is work program, and then documentation and reporting. The nature and extent, and whether the nature and extent of such policies and procedures or guidance is commensurate with the size and circumstances of an entity, and क्या internal audit department के पास quality control policies and procedures भी है. So basically what are the factors? Existence, adequacy, and use of the documented internal audit procedures or the guidance for the risk assessment, work programs, documentation, and reporting, and the nature and extent of which is commensurate with the size and circumstances of the entity, and whether the internal audit function has appropriate quality control policies and procedures. So this is what we have learned: application of a systematic and disciplined approach, objectivity, and then competence. ठीक है, तो ये हमने पूरा अभी समझ लिया है. Let's have a break for 1 minute, then we can again go on. We have now learned that the internal audit function should be sufficiently objective, it should be sufficiently competent, and it should apply a systematic and disciplined approach to performing the internal audit. ठीक है, तो अब हम वो circumstances पढ़ते हैं जहाँ पे internal audit function cannot be used. तो मान लो अगर वो objectivity नहीं, उसके पास objectivity नहीं है, मतलब internal audit function is not objective, it means he is not independent. Internal audit function is not independent of the management functions. ठीक है, तो then we cannot use the internal audit function. या फिर वो competent नहीं है, या फिर वो competent नहीं है, या फिर वो basically it does not apply the systematic and disciplined approach. तो ये तीन circumstances ऐसे हैं. The external auditor shall not use the work of internal audit functions if the external auditor determine that the functions organizational structure and relevant policies and procedures do not adequately support the objectivity. तो मतलब the functions organizational structure and the relevant policies and procedures do not adequately support the objectivity. Objectivity को नहीं support करता है. The functions lack sufficient competence. Competence नहीं है या फिर function does not apply a systematic and disciplined approach including quality control. So मैंने बोला circumstances when the work of the internal audit function cannot be used. So organization structure do not support objectivity. ठीक है. Function lacks competence या फिर function does not apply a systematic and disciplined approach. ठीक है. तो इन cases में मैं ये decide कर सकता हूँ that I will not use the work. ठीक है. Determine whether when you will not use the work of the internal audit. तो मैंने बोला organization structure and the relevant policies and procedures does not support the objectivity. या फिर मैंने बोला internal audit function lacks competence या फिर internal audit function does not apply a systematic and disciplined approach including quality control. ये तो हो गए 3 circumstances जहाँ पे I will determine that I will not use the work. ठीक है. कुछ ऐसे बहुत circumstances भी हो सकते हैं जहाँ पे I will decide that I will use the less work of the internal audit function and will perform more of the work directly. ठीक है. मतलब more of the work I will perform and I will use very less part of the internal audit function. तो it depends on the following things. ठीक है. मैंने बोला the external auditor shall make all significant judgments in the audit engagement. तो जितनी भी significant judgments है that should be made by the external auditor itself. ठीक है. So circumstances in which the external auditor shall plan to use less of the work of the internal audit function and perform more of the work directly. तो मैंने बोला जहां पे significant judgments ज्यादा involved होगी वहां पे I will use less of the work of the internal auditor. So external auditor shall make all significant judgments in the audit engagement and to prevent undue use of the work of the internal audit function shall plan to use less of the work of the function and perform more of the work directly. मतलब internal auditor का काम नहीं यूज करके आपको खुद परफॉर्म करना है. तो मैंने बोला external auditor ठीक है shall make all the significant judgments. तो external auditor को ही लेनी है कोई भी significant judgment हो तो the external auditor shall make all significant judgments in the audit engagement and to prevent undue use. या तो आप undue use नहीं कर रहे हो of the work of the internal audit function, मतलब आप over use नहीं कर रहे हो of the internal audit function, and external auditor shall plan to use the less of the work of the function and perform more of the work directly in the following circumstances. तो मैंने बोला ज्यादा judgment involved है, the more judgment is involved in planning and performing a relevant audit procedure. So more judgment is involved in planning and performing audit procedures, then he should directly perform rather than involving internal auditor. तो मैंने बोला ज्यादा judgment involved है. या फिर मैंने बोला evaluating the evidence. तो मैंने बोला ज्यादा जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व है इन इवेल्युएटिंग द ऑडिट एविडेंस. तो मुझे जजमेंट कहाँ इन्वॉल्व है कि इन प्लानिंग एंड परफॉर्मेंस. तो मैंने बोला प्लानिंग में क्या होता है, मैंने बोला स्कोप, टाइमिंग एंड डायरेक्शन. तो व्हाट इज द नेचर, टाइमिंग एंड एक्सटेंट ऑफ द ऑडिट प्रोसीजर टू बी अप्लाइड. तो उसमें जजमेंट इन्वॉल्व है. ठीक है. तो एक ऐसा एरिया है जिसमें जजमेंटल एरियाज है कि ये प्रोसीजर भी लग सकता है, ये भी लग सकता है, ये भी लग सकता है. ठीक है. तो कहाँ पे there is more judgment involved in planning and performing the relevant audit procedures and also in evaluating the audit evidence gathered. ठीक है. So more judgment is involved, the less the involvement of the internal auditor. So the more judgment is involved, the less the involvement of the internal auditor. तो मैंने बोला the more judgment is involved either in planning and performing the audit procedure or in evaluating the audit evidence gathered. ठीक है. तो आपको evaluate करना है कि भाई क्या audit evidence जो मुझे मिला है क्या वो सही है या नहीं है. Evaluating the audit evidence gathered. ठीक है. ये हमने समझा. फिर हमने बोला the higher the risk, auditor shall perform the procedures directly. So the higher the assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level, with special consideration given to the risk identified as significant risk. तो higher risk और significant risk में आपको खुद ही directly perform करना है procedures rather than involving in the internal auditor. या फिर मैंने देखा कि जो इंटरनल ऑडिटर है that is not more objective, मतलब ज्यादा इंडिपेंडेंट नहीं है of the entity. So the less the internal audit functions, organizational status and relevant policies and procedures adequately support the objectivity of the internal audit function. अगर मान लो organizational structure and relevant policies and procedures do not support the objectivity, तो हम तो work use ही नहीं करेंगे. लेकिन हम उसका वर्क हम लेस यूज करेंगे अगर ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल स्ट्रक्चर एंड रेलेवेंट पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोसीजर्स सपोर्ट द ऑब्जेक्टिविटी एट अ लेस लेवल, ठीक है। एंड सिमिलरली जब हमने उसकी कॉम्पिटेंस को इवैल्यूएट किया कि वो अगर या तो कॉम्पिटेंट बिल्कुल भी नहीं है तो मैं यूज ही नहीं करूंगा, बट the lower the level of competence, I will perform more of the procedures directly rather than to involve internal auditor in performing the procedures. मैंने बोला these are the circumstances in which the external auditor shall plan to use less of the work of the internal auditor and internal audit function and perform more of the work directly. मतलब जहाँ पे basically significant judgments है ताकि it could prevent the undue use of the work of the internal audit function, and he shall use less of the work of the internal audit function and perform more of the work directly in the following circumstances. The more judgment is involved in planning and performing the audit, the more judgment is involved in evaluating the audit evidence. Okay, the higher the ROM, including the special considerations given to the significant risk, okay, to the risk identified as significant. And the less the objectivity, the lesser should be the involvement of the internal auditor, and less the competence, the lesser should be the involvement of the auditor, and more of the procedures would be performed directly by the external auditor, ठीक है। अभी आ जाते हैं, अपना टॉपिक है। अभी हमने क्या समझा था सबसे पहले जब हमने ऑब्जेक्टिव पढ़ा था ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर when evaluating the work. So the objective of the external auditor when the entity has an internal audit function and the external auditor has determined to use the work of the auditor of the internal audit function to modify the nature, timing, and extent, that is to reduce the audit procedures to be performed directly by the external auditor, या फिर to use internal auditor to provide direct assistance, then you should consider that determine whether work can be used. तो मैंने बोला work can be used depends on competence, objectivity, and application of systematic and disciplined approach. अगर ये तीनों चीजें मतलब तीनों में से एक भी चीज अवेलेबल नहीं है, लाइक ऑब्जेक्टिविटी अवेलेबल नहीं है तो यू कांट यूज, ठीक है, कॉन्फिडेंस अवेलेबल नहीं है तो यू कांट यूज, ठीक है। बट अगर ऑब्जेक्टिविटी है लेकिन वो इतनी सिग्निफिकेंट नहीं है, मतलब लेस है, तो फिर आप लेस ही रिलाय कर सकते हो ऑन दैट थिंग, ठीक है। तो डिटरमाइन वेदर वर्क कैन बी यूज्ड. Now comes the in which areas and to what extent. So this we will answer in our next point, that is what we are discussing. And then using the work of internal audit function, we have to evaluate whether work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. And when using the internal auditor to provide direct assistance, we should direct, supervise, and review their work. तो ये अभी हमें दोनों, और तीसरा पॉइंट अभी हम बाद में कवर करते हैं, बट व्हाट वी हैव टू कवर नाउ इज नेचर एंड एक्सटेंट. व्हाट इज द नेचर एंड एक्सटेंट of the you can say the nature and extent to which we can use the work of the internal auditor. So the discussion is around determining the nature and extent of the work of the internal audit function that can be used. तो इसके लिए अपन समझते हैं हम बेसिकली उतना ही काम यूज कर पाएंगे जितना उनके स्कोप में डिसाइड किया है बाय ऑडिट कमिटी. तो जनरली ऑडिट कमिटी डिसाइड करती है the scope of work of the internal audit function. So we have to understand the nature. So as a basis for determining the areas and to what extent to which the work of the internal auditor function can be used, so to determine the areas and to the extent to which the work of the internal audit function can be used, the auditor shall consider the following things. That is, what is the nature and scope of the work that has been performed? So what is the nature and scope of the work that has been performed? So you have to consider what is the nature and the scope of the work that has been performed or is planned to be performed. So what is the nature and scope of the work that has been performed or is planned to be performed by the internal audit function and its relevance to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. तो बेसिकली इंटरनल ऑडिट का क्या नेचर ऑफ काम करता है इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन. दूसरा, व्हाट इज द स्कोप एंड इट्स लिंकेज टू द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर्स ओवरऑल ऑडिट स्ट्रेटजी एंड ऑडिट प्लान. ठीक है, तो आपको समझना पड़ेगा, ठीक है, यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड द नेचर एंड स्कोप ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शंस वर्क that is to be performed या फिर has been performed, that is to be performed या फिर has been performed of the internal audit function and its relevance to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. इसको समझ के आपको डिसाइड करने पड़ेगा that what is the nature and extent to which you can rely on the work of the internal audit function. So as a basis for determining the areas and extent to which the work of the internal audit function can be used, the external auditor shall consider, you have to consider the nature and scope of the work that has been performed or is planned to be performed by the internal audit function and it's relevant to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. So what is its relevance to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan? So what is the nature and scope of the internal of the work that has been performed by the internal audit team, or is it planned to be performed by the internal audit function? And what is its relevance to the external auditor's overall audit strategy and plan? So in other words, once the external auditor has determined that the work of the internal function can be used, तो अपने ऊपर determine कर लिया whether the work can be used, तो can be used for the purposes of the audit. The first consideration is whether the planned nature and scope of the work of the internal audit function that has been performed or is planned to be performed is relevant to the overall audit strategy and audit plan that the external auditor has established. तो auditor आपको पता है overall audit strategy and audit plan बनाता है. So we have to think about that whether this overall audit strategy and audit plan and what is the nature and scope of the internal auditors, you can say, work and internal auditors work. Take a nature and scope of the work that has been performed or is planned to be performed by the internal audit function, and it's relevant whether it is relevant to the auditor's overall audit strategy and audit plan. Audit strategy means scope, timing, and direction of the audit. Audit plan means nature, timing, and extent of the further audit procedures, nature, timing, and extent of the risk assessment procedure, and then other procedures as required by SS. So that is set in the audit plan. Okay. So अभी हमने बोला nature and extent of the work which you can use. So then we consider the objectives. That is whether we can use the work of internal auditor and in which areas and to what extent. Okay. So to what extent is answered by this paragraph, that we can use the work of internal to an extent that it is relevant to our overall audit strategy and audit plan, and so the nature and scope of the internal audit function is relevant to the overall audit strategy and audit plan. So that is the extent to which we can plan to use the work of internal auditor. Okay. Abhi examples of the work of the internal audit function that can be used by the external auditor include the following. तो आप टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल्स में एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर को इंटरनल ऑडिटर को यूज कर सकते हो. So test of controls में you can think about using the internal control, but do remember आप कम से कम यूज करना चाहोगे the higher the SS ROM, और significant risk में भी आप कम से कम यूज करना चाहोगे. तो I think higher ROM में आप जनरली नहीं यूज करते. तो मैंने बोला टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल्स में अगर वो लोअर रिस्क है या हायर लोअर रिस्क है तो यू विल यूज. ठीक है, जनरली हर चीज में भी मतलब the higher the ROM, the significant the ROM, you will plan to use the less the work of the internal audit function. ठीक है, तो testing of the operating effectiveness of control you can think about and use the work of its internal auditor. ठीक है, so examples of the work of the internal audit function that can be used by the external auditor includes the following. So testing the operating effectiveness of the control and substantive procedures involving limited judgment. मैंने बोला substantive procedures involving limited judgment. एग्जांपल लेते हैं. मैंने बोला आपको एक परचेज इनवॉइस को वेरीफाई करना है, तो आपने परचेज ऑर्डर से वेरीफाई कर लिया, उसकी सब्सिक्वेंट पेमेंट से वेरीफाई कर लिया और आपने बोल दिया इनवॉइस करेक्ट है. तो इट डज नॉट इन्वॉल्व एनी जजमेंट नहीं है इसमें. यू हैव टू कंपेयर द इनवॉइस विद द परचेज ऑर्डर एंड यू हैव टू चेक वेदर द अमाउंट हैज बीन अप्रोप्रिएटली पेड आउट टू द अप्रोप्रिएट पार्टी. ठीक है, तो दीज आर द सब्सटैंटिव प्रोसीजर्स इन्वॉल्विंग लिमिटेड जजमेंट. अब कुछ ऐसा भी हो सकता है सब्सटैंटिव प्रोसीजर्स इन्वॉल्विंग वेरी हायर जजमेंट. मान लो कि एक एस्टिमेट को आपको देखना है, जैसे लेट्स सपोज इवैल्यूएटिंग द यूजफुल लाइफ ऑफ प्रॉपर्टी प्लांट एंड इक्विपमेंट. आपको ये देखना है क्या प्रॉपर्टी प्लांट एंड इक्विपमेंट की लाइफ इज रीजनेबल विद द यूसेज पैटर्न ऑफ द एंटिटी. जैसे एंटिटी उस एसेट को यूज करती है, whether the useful life aligns to the usage pattern of the entity. So in case of substantive procedures involving very limited judgment, you can think of involving the internal auditor. So in testing the operating effectiveness of controls, and then in substantive procedures involving limited judgments, and you can also think of taking the work of internal audit function in case of the observation of the inventory counts. Just let's suppose inventory counts does not involve much of the judgment, right? So you can involve in observation of the inventory counts, and then you can also involve internal auditor in tracing transactions. मतलब एक अकाउंटिंग ट्रांजैक्शन को उसके सोर्स से ट्रेस करना. ठीक है, जो हमने ऑडिट ट्रेल में पढ़ा था. तो ट्रेसिंग ट्रांजैक्शन थ्रू इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम रेलेवेंट टू द फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग. मैंने बोला ट्रेसिंग ट्रांजैक्शन थ्रू इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम टू द relevant to the financial reporting. So you have to trace back the transaction to its source. So you have to trace back the transaction to its source through information system, and then you need to test when testing the compliance with regulatory requirement. You can also consider involving the internal audit. इसका लॉजिक क्या है? इसका लॉजिक क्या है? जब हमने स्कोप ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिटर पढ़ा था ऊपर, सबसे पहला डिस्कशन जहां पे हमने पढ़ा था कि स्कोप ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर जनरली आल्सो इंक्लूड्स the scope. What does it include? What it also include the review of the compliance with laws and regulation, yahi pe, right? So it also include the review of the compliance with laws and regulation. Review of compliance with laws and regulation. It also includes review of compliance with laws and regulation. ये हमने समझा था. Now just moving on to this is clear to us. This is also clear. तो हमने ये पढ़ लिया है कि हम किन किन एरियाज में यूज कर सकते हैं. तो मैंने बोला व्हेन टेस्टिंग द ऑपरेटिंग इफेक्टिवनेस ऑफ कंट्रोल, when substantive procedures involve very limited judgment, when observation of the inventory counts and tracing transaction that is recorded through information system to so tracing transaction through the information system relevant to the financial reporting. तो आपको पता है कंपनी ने लोन लिया है 200 करोड़ का, तो 200 करोड़ के ट्रांजेक्शन को इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम में ट्रेस बैक करना और उसको सोर्स से मैप कर पाना, दैट कैन बी डन बाय internal auditor, and testing of compliance with regulatory requirements. So if they can ensure compliance with regulatory requirement, because in their scope what we studied, they also review the compliance with laws and regulation, and therefore we can involve them in compliance testing of the compliance with regulatory requirements. So we can involve them in testing the operating effectiveness of control. We can, very important to note, we can only involve them in testing the operating effectiveness, but not the design and implementation part. Okay, very, very important. So what they are saying is testing of the operating effectiveness of control. पेपर में हो सकता है एमसीक्यू में पूछ ले, डिजाइन एंड इम्प्लीमेंटेशन के लिए हम क्या इन्वॉल्व कर सकते हैं? क्या हम डिजाइन एंड इम्प्लीमेंटेशन के लिए कर सकते हैं? तो जवाब है नहीं. डिजाइन को एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर को देखना है ना कि द कंट्रोल इज डिजाइन सफिशिएंटली प्रिसाइज टू प्रिवेंट, डिटेक्ट एंड करेक्ट अ मटेरियल मिसस्टेटमेंट. So testing of the operating effectiveness of internal control can be leveraged to the internal audit function. Then substantive procedures involving very limited judgment can be leveraged to them. Observation of inventory counts can be leveraged to them. वो inventory count में जाके ऑब्जर्व कर सकते हैं हमारी की सही काउंटिंग हो रही है. ऑब्जर्वेशन ऑफ इन्वेंटरी काउंट्स कैन बी लेवरेज टू देम, एंड ट्रेसिंग ट्रांजैक्शन थ्रू द इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम रेलेवेंट टू द फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग कैन बी गिवन टू देम, and testing compliance with regulatory requirements can be given to them since they already review compliance with laws and regulations. So testing of compliance with law regulatory requirements can be given to them. ठीक है, तो ये हमने पूरा समझ लिया है पूरा फ्लो. Let's touch upon the last two topics. Let's have a break for 1 minute and let's again regroup and finish these two topics that are pending in this SA 610. Okay, thanks. Joining in 1 minute. Okay. Yeah. Now let us start with using the work of the internal audit function as an audit evidence by the external auditor. तो हमने बोला था कि the objective of the external auditor in accordance with SA 610 was basically the three objectives: whether determine whether he can use the work of the internal auditor, in what areas and to what extent. Then using the work of internal audit function, is the work is adequate for the using the work of the internal audit function to ensure that the work is adequate for the purposes of the audit, to evaluate that the work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. ठीक है, तो अब जो हमारा डिस्कशन है that we have planned to use the work of the internal audit function. We have planned to use the work of the internal audit function. And we have to evaluate that it is adequate for the external auditors purposes. ठीक है, if the external auditor plans to use the work of the internal audit function, the auditor shall. So we have to discuss the planned use of the internal auditor's work. So we have to discuss with the internal auditor that we are planning to use its work as a basis for coordination, so that we can coordinate. So I have to discuss the planned use of its work. So I have to discuss, as an auditor, I need to discuss the planned use of its work, means the planned use of the internal audit's work. If the external auditor plans to use the work of the internal audit work, internal audit function, the external auditor shall discuss the planned use. What is the planned use? How will I use your work? Okay, planned use of its work with the function as a basis for coordinating their respective activities, so that you can coordinate the work. Okay, then I have to, once you discuss the planned use, obviously you need to have regular communications with the internal auditor, right? So you need to discuss the planned use of the internal auditor's work, the planned use of its work with the function. So we have to discuss with with the internal auditor function, so that we can form a, so that it act as a basis for coordinating their respective activities, so that we can coordinate the external auditor and the internal auditor can coordinate. So you have to discuss the planned use of its work. Then you need to read the reports of the internal audit function. You need to understand what was the nature of the audit procedures that they have applied and what are their findings. Okay, so you have to read the reports of the internal audit function relating to the work of the function that the external auditor plans to use. Okay, so we have to discuss the plan of the use of the internal audit function with the internal audit team, so that we can coordinate. Then I should read, as an auditor, I should read the reports that is related to the work of the function that I intend to use, that the external auditor plans to use to obtain an understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedures performed and the related findings by the internal auditor, and then perform sufficient audit procedures. Then you should perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work. That is, on the body of the work means on the work that has been done by internal auditor. So because eventually the responsibility of the opinion rests with you, so you should obtain sufficient and appropriate audit, or you should perform sufficient appropriate audit procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole, that the external auditor plans to use to determine its adequacy for the purpose of the audit. ठीक है, तो अभी हमने इसको कैसे summarize किया? So external auditor plans to use the work of the internal audit function. So when the external auditor has planned to use the work of the internal audit function, he should discuss the planned use of its work with the function, so that it acts as a basis for coordinating their respective activities. Then internal audit function should be issuing those reports, right? So you have to read the reports. You have to read the reports of the internal audit function and obtain an understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedures performed by them and what are their related findings relating to the above areas. That is the planned use. So the areas that you have communicated and discussed with the internal auditor, right? And then you should perform sufficient appropriate audit procedures on the body of the work that has been done by the internal auditor, so that it is adequate for the purpose of your audit, so that it's adequate for the purpose of your audit. ठीक है, तो एक काम करते हैं, let's try to learn it. ठीक है, मैंने बोला if the using the work of the internal audit function. So when using the work of an internal audit function as an audit evidence, the auditor shall evaluate the adequacy for its purpose, right? You have to evaluate that the work done is adequate. So if the external auditor plans to use the work of the internal audit function, the external auditor shall discuss. So you have to discuss the planned use of its work with the function as a basis for coordinating their respective activities. You have to read the reports of the internal audit function relating to the work of the function that the external auditor plans to use to obtain an understanding of the procedures, nature and extent of the audit procedures it performed and the related findings. And you have to perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole that the external auditor plans to use to determine its adequacy for the purpose of audit. तो मैंने बोला एक काम करते हैं, लेट्स लिंक इट फ्रॉम हेयर. ठीक है, तो हमने बोला ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ऑफ एक्सटर्नल ऑडिट, राइट? वी लर्न द ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिट व्हेन द एंटिटी हैज एन इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन एंड द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर प्लान्स टू and the external auditor expects to use the work of the function to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures to be performed directly by the auditor. He should determine whether the work can be used, in what areas he can use it, and to what extent he can use it. Anna, right? Then we learned in what all areas it can be used, whether it can be used or not, and to what extent we can use it. Okay. Then we learned about the using the work of internal audit function. We should evaluate whether it is adequate for the purpose of the audit. So if using the work of the internal audit function, we have to determine, auditor has to determine whether that work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. So when using the work of the internal audit function, when I am using the work of the internal audit function as an audit evidence, I should evaluate, you should determine whether the work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. Now we were discussing this concept that whether the auditor's work is adequate, internal auditor's work is adequate for the purposes of the external audit, then you should consider. So when you are planning to use the work of the internal auditor as an audit evidence, then you should discuss this, discuss the planning. So discuss the planned use of the internal auditor's work with the internal audit function so that you can coordinate between the respective activities, ताकि ये पता हो कि आपको कब report मिलेगी, when you can get back to them, so that you can coordinate the respective activities. Then you should read the reports of the internal audit function. You should read the reports of the internal audit function pertaining to the relating to the work of the function that you plans to use, that the external auditor plans to use to obtain understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedures it performed and the related findings. What are the nature and extent of the procedures it performed? So I'm saying that it's not the direction, supervision, and review. I will not decide what the procedure will be performed. It will be internal auditor who has decided and performed the nature and audit extent of the audit procedure. So I should determine whether what was the nature and extent of the procedures performed and what are the related findings. And I should perform substantive audit procedures on the body of the work. I should perform procedures on the body of the work so as to get comfort that it is adequate for the purposes of the audit. Okay. So I have to perform sufficient procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole that the external auditor plans to use to determine its adequacy for the purpose of the audit. Okay. And then you have to discuss and coordinate with the internal audit function. So you have to discuss the planned use of the internal auditor's work with the function as a basis for coordinating their respective activities, right? So you have to discuss and coordinate with the internal audit function. So in discussing the planned use of their work, in discussing the planned use of their work, what will be the planned usage of the internal auditor's work with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating the respective activities, it may be useful to address the following. Okay. So in discussing the planned, so this point, in discussing the planned use of its work with the function as a basis for coordinating their respective activities, it should be discussed. It is useful to address the following matters. So when discussing with the internal auditor, you can prepare one PPT and discuss about the following matters: that what will be the timing of such work, when will you perform the work, what is the nature of such nature of the work performed, what is the nature, ठीक है, क्या nature का आप काम करके दोगे, what is the nature of the audit procedures you will apply, then extent of the audit coverage, what percentage you will cover, right, what is the extent, then you will tell them about the R materiality, right, so that they can have consideration of it when determining their samples, right. So materiality and performance materiality and proposed methods of item selection and sample sizes. You can talk about what could be the possible method. Method means random sampling or monetary unit sampling or haphazard sampling or stratified sampling of proposed methods of item selection and what would be the sample sizes. So you can deliberate so that nature, timing, and extent, materiality, and sampling. Then you can when you can expect the documentation of the work performed and what is the review and reporting procedures by the internal auditor. So in discussing, so external auditor planned to use the work of the internal audit function. So he should discuss the planned use of its work with the function so as to act as a basis for coordinating their respective activities, right? In discussing the planned use of their work with the internal audit function as a basis for coordinating the respective activities, it may be useful to address the following. What is the timing of the work? When I expect a report from the internal auditor, what is the nature of the work performed that I expect from internal auditor to apply, right? Extent means to what extent you can, what is the extent of audit coverage of the internal auditor? What is the materiality and the performance materiality? What is the proposed method of selections of sample and the sample sizes? So in coordinating the efforts, in discussing the plans about the usage of the internal auditor's work, I can tell him about that I plan to use your work. So what will be the timing? When can I expect it? What is the nature of the work you plans to perform? What is the extent of the audit coverage that you are doing? And I can tell them that, yeah, this is the materiality and performance materiality that we use. This is the sampling method and sample size that we use, right? And we can also inform that, yeah, we expect the report to include the documentation of the work performed, that what are the procedures that you have performed. So we can mention them, yeah, we expect you to include in your internal audit report what are the specific procedures you have performed so that we can evaluate, yeah, that whether, so you have to read the reports and then you have to perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work, right? So read the reports and obtain an understanding of the nature and extent of the audit procedures performed and what are the related findings. So you can tell them that upfrontly, you can tell internal auditors, right, that you would want the documentation of the what has been the work performed and what is the review and reporting procedures, right? So how would the review take place at their end and how would the eventual report be issued? So when external auditors plans to use the work of the internal audit function, he should discuss the planned use of its work with the function so that it acts as a basis for coordinating their respective activities. He should read the reports of the internal audit function. He should read the report of the internal audit function to understand what has been the nature and extent of the procedures applied and what are their resultant findings. And I should perform sufficient and appropriate procedures and on the body of the work, right, which the internal audit function has performed. So as a whole, that the external auditor plans to use to determine so as to evaluate that, yeah, it's adequate for the purposes of my audit. Then I need to discuss what is the timing of the work that the internal auditor is planning, what is the nature of the work he's planning to do, what is the extent of the audit coverage. I would tell him about my materiality and performance materiality. I would tell him about my sample selection methods and sample sizes. Then I would tell him about the documentation of the work performed. That is that I expect your report to include the procedures, specific procedures that you have performed, so as to evaluate its sufficiency for the purpose of my work, right? So that I can evaluate this and what is the reporting and review timelines, what procedures and timelines, right? So coordination between the external auditor and the internal audit function is effective. मैंने बोला coordination तब कब इफेक्टिव होता है जब मैंने बोला there is a frequent discussion at appropriate intervals between the external and internal auditor. So मैंने बोला discussions take place at appropriate interval throughout the period. So there is a greater effective coordination, right? So in these circumstances, there will be a greater coordination between the internal auditor and the external auditor when they discuss the discussions take place at appropriate intervals. ठीक है? So discussion take place at appropriate interval. फिर मैंने बोला external auditor internal auditor को बताता है about the significant matters that he has identified and vice versa also. Internal auditor also informs the external auditors of the significant matters that he has identified that may affect the function of the external auditor, and external auditor similarly communicate करता है internal auditor को all the significant matters that he has identified and that may impact the that may affect the functions work. ठीक है? So external auditor informs the internal audit function of significant matters that may affect the function. So external auditor informs the internal audit function of significant matters that may affect the function, and the external auditor is advised of and has access to the relevant reports of the internal audit function and is informed of any significant matter that come to the attention of the function when such matters may affect the work of the external auditor, so that external auditor is able to consider the implication of such matter for the audit engagement. Basically मैंने बोला the coordination is effective. Coordination is effective when there is a discussion, frequent discussions. ठीक है? Discussions takes place at appropriate intervals throughout the period. मैंने बोला फिर मुझे internal audit को मैं भी significant matters के बारे में बताता हूँ. ठीक है? As and when it comes to my notice and which may affect the area that is done by internal auditor, and internal auditor भी simultaneously मुझे significant matters के बारे में बताता है as and when they are made aware of it. ठीक है? So external auditor informs the internal audit function of significant matters that may affect that function. The external auditor is advised of and access to the relevant, and he has also access to the relevant reports of the internal audit function and is informed of any significant matters that come to the attention of the function when such matters may affect the work of the external auditor, so that he can consider the implication of such matters for the audit engagement. Right? तो एक काम करते हैं, वापस ऑब्जेक्टिव से शुरू करते हैं. ऑब्जेक्टिव मैंने बोला ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर. When the entity is using the internal audit function, external auditor expects to use the work of the function to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedure to be performed directly by the external auditor. Then he should determine whether using the work of the internal audit function is adequate for the purposes of the audit. Okay. So if for this he will coordinate, he will discuss basically the planned use of its work, that is the planned use of the internal audit function work with the function so as to coordinate their respective activities. He will read the reports of the internal audit function that has been issued to understand the nature and you can say extent of the procedures performed and what are their related findings. And he will perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole that the external auditor plans to use to determine its adequacy for the purposes of the audit. And then discussion and coordination with internal audit function. So he will discuss basically मैं क्या क्या discuss करूँगा कि भाई I will discuss what is the timing when can I expect report from you,
what is the nature of the work that you plan to perform, that is nature of the procedures you plan to do. Then extent means what is the extent of the audit coverage that you plan to perform. Then I will tell him about our certain matters, like what is our materiality, what is our performance materiality, what generally we use at the time of sampling, that is sampling method and sample size. I will tell him, and I will also tell him that I expect the documentation of the work performed, that is the documentation of the procedures performed, to be included in our report, that yeah, these are the procedures, so that I can evaluate. I have to, when I read the report, I can understand what is the nature and extent of the procedures performed and what are the related findings, and what is your reporting and review procedures along with the timeline. So this is what I will consider when coordinating the respective activities. It may be useful to address the following elements, right? Nature, timing, extent, materiality, sample selection, documentation, reporting, and review. Then we turn on to the topic that coordination between internal auditor and external auditor is considered to be more effective if there are appropriate discussions take place at appropriate intervals throughout the period. So discussions take place at appropriate intervals. External auditors informs the internal auditor of any significant matter that may affect the function. Take care, that may affect the function. Similarly, external auditor is being advised to, if any significant matter comes to the attention of the internal auditor that may affect the external auditor's work, right? So that external auditor can consider its implication for of such matter for the audit engagement. So that and external auditor is also made available access to the relevant report. जैसे मान लो वो रिपोर्ट का उसका ड्राइव का लिंक दे दिया कि भाई ये हम रिपोर्ट हर रोज आप देख सकते हो कि ये अपडेट हुआ है, रिपोर्ट में ये चीजें ऐड हुई है, राइट? So this is how the coordination between the external auditor and the internal auditor can become effective. So the first part is, what are the procedures that the external auditor needs to perform so as to use the work of the internal auditor as an audit evidence? So the first question would be framed in this way. Then the second question that is in planned. So you will discuss the planned, you can say, use of the internal audit functions, and so as to base the coordination of the respective activities, right? So when you will consider this factor, right, then what all things you would want to cover? You will want to cover what is the timing of the work, right? Timing of the report that we can expect. What is the nature of the work performed? What is the extent of the audit coverage? Then auditor will tell the internal auditor about the materiality and what is the sample selection method that they generally use and what is the sample size that they generally consider, right? And then documentation. So what external auditor will tell internal auditor is that yeah, we expect that the procedures performed by you will be documented in such a form that we can understand what is the nature of the procedure performed, and then reporting and review. So this is something what we have discussed. So and then coordination between the external auditor and the internal audit function is effective. So discussion must have happened at appropriate intervals. External auditor should have informed internal auditor about the significant matters. External auditor should be advised, and in case he should also be given access to the reports in of the internal audit function, and he should external auditor should be informed of any significant matters that would impact the work of the external auditor, and he may consider what implications would it have on the audit engagement. So this is what we have covered using the work of an internal audit function, and that is what we have covered, right? Yeah, so let us lastly cover the last topic of this essay, that is determine whether, in which areas and to what extent we can use the work of internal auditors in the form of direct assistance. Direct assistance means वो बंदा मेरे साथ काम करेगा, ठीक है, internal auditor मेरे साथ काम करेगा under my direction, supervision and review. So direct assistance refers to the use of internal auditors. So it refers to the use of the internal auditors to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. The external auditor may be prohibited by law or by regulation from obtaining direct assistance. तो हो सकता है कि law or regulation does not permit direct assistance, but direct assistance is a concept wherein it refers to the use of the internal auditors to perform audit procedures under the direction, supervision, and review. Okay. If using the internal auditors to provide direct assistance is not prohibited by law or regulation, and the external auditor plans to use the internal auditors to provide direct assistance on the audit, तो auditor को दो चीजें evaluate करनी है
है ना, ऑब्जेक्टिविटी देखनी है, दूसरा कॉम्पिटेंस देखना है। द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर शैल इवैल्यूएट द एग्जिस्टेंस एंड सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ थ्रेट्स टू ऑब्जेक्टिविटी एंड व्हाट इज द लेवल ऑफ कॉम्पिटेंस ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिटर हु विल बी प्रोवाइडिंग सच असिस्टेंस। सो एग्जिस्टेंस और एंड सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ थ्रेट्स टू ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, तो जब आपको पता होगा, जब हम यूजिंग द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन पढ़ रहे थे, तो लेट मी जस्ट ब्रिंग यू दैट पॉइंट। वहां पे भी हमने क्या चीजें देखी थी, दो ही चीजें देखी थी, दैट इज कॉम्पिटेंस एंड ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, ठीक है। एंड द अनदर वन पॉइंट वाज एप्लीकेशन ऑफ अ सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन्ड अप्रोच। अब वो पॉइंट यहाँ पे नहीं एप्लीकेबल होगा, क्योंकि द इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स आर वर्किंग अंडर द डायरेक्ट सुपरविजन ऑफ द ऑडिटर एंड देयरफॉर द सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन्ड अप्रोच वुड अप्लाई ऑफ द ऑडिटर, ठीक है। तो ऑडिटर की खुद की जो क्वालिटी कंट्रोल पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोसीजर्स है वो लगेंगे, राइट। So this point is now no more relevant. The only two points are relevant here are objectivity and competence. So evaluating the internal audit function. So this is something that is clear to us, right? तो यहाँ पे सिर्फ objectivity and competence का ही concept आएगा, ठीक है। objectivity and competence का ही concept आएगा। एक काम करते हैं, let's revise it. So मैंने बोला if using the work of internal auditor in the form of direct assistance is not prohibited by law or regulation, the external auditor can plan to use the work of internal auditor to provide direct assistance, but he must ensure two things, है ना। The auditor shall evaluate the existence and significance. So he should evaluate the existence and significance of threats to objectivity and the level of the competence of the internal auditors who will be providing such assistance. The external auditor's evaluation of the existence and significance of threats to internal auditor's objectivity shall include, it shall also include inquiry of the internal auditor's personnel regarding interest and relationship that may create a threat to their objectivity. तो हो सकता है कि इंटरनल ऑडिट पर्सनल के पास कंपनी के शेयर्स हो, तो देयर माइट बी सम सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट थ्रेट। सो द एक्सटर्नल ऑडिटर has to evaluate the existence and significance of threats to objectivity and level of competence of the internal auditor. The external auditor's evaluation of the existence and significance of threats to internal auditor's objectivity it shall mandatorily include inquiry of the internal auditors regarding the interest and relationship. हम उससे पूछेंगे whether do you have any interest or whether do you have any relationship with the entity that may create a threat to their objectivity, ठीक है। and very important to point to note, जब हम ऊपर objectivity या competence को evaluate करते हैं, जब हम ऊपर objectivity को evaluate करते हैं, तो we never inquire, ठीक है। इनको हम वहां पे it is not mandatory, we can obviously do it but it's not mandatory, but here the word is shall, ठीक है। so when evaluating the internal auditor's objectivity, it's mandatory for the external auditor, it's mandatory for the external auditor to include inquiry of the internal auditors regarding the interest and relationship that may create a threat to their objectivity. So objectivity and competence are the two same points, है ना, but the application of you can say systematic and disciplined approach will not be applicable here, considering the overall quality control policies and procedures will be applied of the auditor, because auditor is driving, auditor is given the direction, supervision and review for the direct assistance, right? So that point is no more relevant. So अभी आप the external auditor shall not use an internal auditor, तो हम ऊपर वाले तीन situations में use नहीं करते थे when हमने जब ऊपर पढ़ा था using the work of internal audit function, तो हमने पढ़ा था तीन situations में we will not use the work of internal audit function. थ्री सिचुएशंस वर कि या तो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी नहीं है इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन की, या फिर मैंने बोला कॉम्पिटेंट नहीं है इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, या फिर the function does not have a systematic and disciplined approach, ठीक है। तो अभी नीचे ये दो पॉइंट रह जाएंगे, that is the internal auditors are not competent. यहाँ पे नीचे जो वर्ड आएगा that is not internal audit function but it will be only internal auditors are not competent, internal auditors are not ऑब्जेक्टिव, ठीक है। तो दो ही पॉइंट आएंगे क्योंकि तीसरा पॉइंट रेलेवेंट नहीं है। फिर हमने पढ़ा था डिटरमाइनिंग द नेचर एंड एक्सटेंट ऑफ द वर्क ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, राइट। तो हमने बोला था किन किन एरिया में हम यूज कर सकते हैं, एंड हमने फिर ये समझा था कि वी हैव टू नेचर एंड स्कोप ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन वर्क व्हिच हैज, सो वी नीड टू लिंक, सो दिस वाज स्पेसिफिकली for the internal audit function area. So this is something that we can't compare with the direct assistance, ठीक है। फिर हमने ये पढ़ा था जहां पे auditor shall plan to use less of the work of the internal audit function and perform more of the procedures directly. हमने बोला in making some significant judgments, right, all significant judgments are to be made by external auditor. तो ये वाला पॉइंट भी अभी नीचे आएगा, ठीक है। then
in case of higher assess risk of material misstatement, अभी हम नीचे पढ़ेंगे, he cannot use direct assistance if the judgment involved is more than limited judgment, ठीक है, and then और ये तो हमने पढ़ ही लिया था, राइट। तो अभी देखो जब आप नीचे पढ़ोगे कि in which situation you can't use the internal auditor to provide direct assistance. One is lacks objectivity, so there are significant threats to the objectivity of the internal auditor. Very important word here, you have to use internal auditor, ऊपर word use होता था internal audit function, right? So there are significant threats to the objectivity of the internal auditor, or the internal auditor lacks sufficient competence to perform the proposed work. उसके पास competence नहीं है उस काम को करने की. The external auditor shall not use internal auditor to provide direct assistance to perform procedures that involve significant judgment. It's same, ठीक है। अभी वहां पे आप higher assess ROM में use कर सकते हो, but it should be very less, right? You have learned that you can use, but it should be very less involvement of the internal audit function, and you should perform more of the things directly, right? So here in case of the higher assess ROM, where the judgment required in performing the relevant audit procedures is more than limited, then you can't use direct assistance. And if it relates to the work in which the internal auditor has been involved, so let's say direct assistance is related to the work in which the internal auditor was already previously involved, right? Let's say as part of the internal audit function activity, internal auditor was involved in the review, right? So if it relates to the work with which the internal auditors have been involved, है ना, तो जो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन में उसने कवर किया है, you can say evaluation of the control, some specific evaluation of the control, or you can say examination of the financial and operational reporting, है ना, तो वो उसने review of the compliance with laws and regulation जो जो उसने ऊपर किया है, तो हो सकता है कि if you are involving him for the direct assistance to do the same work, it may create self-interested, right? So you have to you can't involve him if it relate to the work in which the internal auditors have been involved. तो जो उसने इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन के स्कोप एंड ऑब्जेक्टिव के तहत काम किया है, आप अगर उसे को बोल रहे हो कि उसी का रिव्यू कर दे, सो इफ इट रिलेट टू द वर्क with the internal auditors have been involved and which has already been or will be reported to the management or TCWG by the internal audit function, तो या तो जो वो ऑलरेडी रिपोर्ट हो चुका है या फिर विल बी रिपोर्टेड, सो देयर इज नो सेंस ऑफ अगेन इन्वॉल्व इन देम, राइट? बिकॉज दैट विल क्रिएट सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट, वो कभी भी ये नहीं बोलेंगे कि उसमें कुछ गलती थी. एंड इफ इट रिलेट्स टू decision of the external auditor that makes in accordance with this essay regarding the internal audit function and the use of its work or direct assistance. So जब मैं as an auditor decide कर रहा हूँ कि whether I should use direct assistance or the internal audit function or use none of them, right? So it cannot be delegated through direct assistance. So the external auditor shall not use internal auditor to provide direct assistance to perform procedures that relate to decisions the external auditors make in this accordance with essay regarding the internal audit function and the use of its work or direct assistance. तो मैं ये delegate नहीं कर सकता. I can't delegate this work in the form of direct assistance, जहाँ पे the decision itself is to have whether to use the internal audit function or to have the direct assistance. Prior to using internal auditors to provide direct assistance for the purpose of the auditor, the auditor shall. तो आपको डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस लेने से पहले आपको एक एग्रीमेंट करना है मैनेजमेंट के साथ, एक एग्रीमेंट करना है इंटरनल ऑडिटर के साथ. मैनेजमेंट के साथ क्या एग्रीमेंट करोगे कि आप इंटरनल ऑडिटर को परेशान नहीं करोगे, जो काम मैं अपने हिसाब से करवाऊंगा उसमें, ठीक है. सो यू हैव टू ऑब्टेन रिटन एग्रीमेंट फ्रॉम एन ऑथराइज्ड रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ द एंटिटी. तो मतलब आपको ऑथराइज्ड रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ द एंटिटी से एक रिटन एग्रीमेंट लेना है that the internal auditor will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instruction, कि जो मैं वो बोलूंगा वो वही करेंगे, ठीक है. Internal auditors will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instruction and the entity will not intervene in the work the internal auditor performs for the external auditor. So entity will not intervene. तो मैंने बोला I should have a written representation, written agreement from the authorized representative of the entity that internal auditors will be allowed to follow, they will be allowed, मतलब entity will not object, right? So internal auditors will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instruction and the entity will not intervene in the work the internal auditor performs for the external auditor. And I have to also obtain a written agreement from the internal auditor that they will keep confidential specific matters as instructed by the external auditor, like methods of sampling, what is the performance materiality and materiality, and inform the external auditor of any threat to their objectivity. So I have to obtain a written agreement from the internal auditor about the first thing, that they will keep confidential some of the specific matters as will keep confidential specific matters as instructed by the external auditor. So some of the specific matters which would are required to be kept confidential will be kept confidential by the internal auditor, and internal auditor will inform the external auditor if there are any threats to their objectivity. If there are any threats to their objectivity, so I have to obtain a written agreement from the entity as well as from the internal auditor. From entity, I would require an agreement that they will allow the internal auditors to follow the external auditor's instruction, and they will not intervene in the work when the internal auditor perform for the external auditor. And I have to obtain also the agreement from the internal auditor that basically he will maintain confidentiality of the specific matters as instructed by the external auditor and inform the external auditor of any threat to their objectivity. ठीक है, अभी अपन चलते हैं इंटरनल फाइनेंशियल कंट्रोल एंड इंटरनल कंट्रोल ओवर फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग, दोनों में फर्क क्या है. मैंने बोला इंटरनल फाइनेंशियल कंट्रोल्स वो कंट्रोल्स होते हैं, these are the processes designed, implemented and maintained. ठीक है, these are the processes designed and implemented and maintained. तो ये processes का काम क्या होता है? To ensure the reliability and relevance of the financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance with laws and regulation, ठीक है, and you can say safeguarding of the assets and prevention and detection of fraud. The internal financial control को हमने last chapter में भी समझा था. The internal financial control refers to the policies and procedures put in place by the companies for ensuring reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance with applicable laws and regulations, safeguarding of assets, and prevention and detection of frauds, right? So IFC includes the policies and procedures put in place by the companies for ensuring reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance with laws and regulations, safeguarding of assets, and prevention and detection of fraud. On the other hand, internal controls over financial reporting का मतलब क्या है? Controls over the financial reporting, मतलब financial statements बनने के लिए इसको हम बोलते हैं financial reporting control process. तो मतलब FRCP बोलते हैं इसे practical life में. तो मैंने बोला internal controls over financial reporting मतलब कैसे consolidation होगा, कैसे trial balance से financials बनेगा. तो what are the controls over the financial reporting? कैसे ensure होगा कि सारे disclosures आ रहे हैं. So on the other hand, so internal financial control includes internal control over financial reporting. So internal financial control is a big term. On the other hand, internal control over financial reporting is required where the auditors are required to express an opinion on the effectiveness of an entity's internal control over financial reporting. So जहाँ पे auditor को ये बोला गया है, auditors are required to express an opinion on the effectiveness of an entity's control over financial reporting. मतलब financial statement जैसे बन रहे हैं. तो अगर मान लो कंट्रोल रेलेवेंट कंट्रोल यहाँ पे क्या है, लेट्स सपोज कंसोलिडेशन हो रहा है, ट्रायल बैलेंस एक बैलेंस शीट बन रही है, ठीक है. सच ओपिनियन इज इन एडिशन टू एंड डिस्टिंक्ट फ्रॉम द ओपिनियन एक्सप्रेस्ड बाय द ऑडिटर ऑन द फाइनेंशियल स्टेटमेंट. तो हो सकता है कि आपको इंटरनल कंट्रोल ओवर फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग के लिए भी ओपिनियन देना पड़ जाए. So this would be a different opinion than the overall opinion on the financial statement. So internal financial control is a wider term, as internal control over financial reporting is a narrower term restricted to entities internal control over financial reporting only. तो जो financial reporting के लिए relevant controls है उन्हीं के ऊपर applicable है. तो एक काम करते हैं, फटाफट ना रिवाइज करते हैं what all we have covered in this lecture. Let's फटाफट रिवाइज it, ठीक है. तो अपन चलते हैं, सबसे पहला टॉपिक आज जो हमने पढ़ा, ठीक है, तो हमने पढ़ा इंटरनल ऑडिट का मतलब क्या होता है. करेक्ट, हमने यहाँ से शुरू किया था इंटरनल ऑडिट का मतलब क्या होता है. तो मैंने इसके लिए आपको कंपोनेंट्स ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल समझाया. कंट्रोल एनवायरनमेंट, एंटिटीज रिस्क असेसमेंट, इंफॉर्मेशन सिस्टम, कंट्रोल एक्टिविटीज, मॉनिटरिंग ऑफ कंट्रोल. मैंने बोला इंटरनल ऑडिट क्या होता है. इट्स द इंटरनल ऑडिट इज एन you can say assurance and consulting activity. It's the function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance. Entity की governance means control environment को बढ़ावा देना. Entity की risk management को बढ़ावा means entities की risk assessment process को बढ़ावा देना, and entity के internal control procedures को बढ़ावा देना, मतलब अच्छा करना, ठीक है. तो इसको review करना. It's a function of an entity. It's a function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. तो हमने पढ़ा governance, risk management, and internal activities relating to internal control. So it's the function of an entity. एक function है entity का that's purpose is to evaluate and improve, evaluate करे and improve करे entities governance process, entities risk management process, and entities internal control. Entity की governance में हमने समझा, he will assess governance process with respect to the accomplishment of the objectives with respect to the following things, right? That is ethics and values are being complied. ठीक है, performance management and accountability, and how does the risk and control information are communicated to the appropriate areas of the organization, and what is the effectiveness of communication amongst TCWG management, internal auditors, and external auditor. Risk management, how does the and entity and it will help in identifying and evaluating significant exposures to the risk. He will contribute to improvement of the risk management in the internal control, and it will also assist the entity in detection of the fraud. Correct. Then we learned about internal control, that is evaluation of internal control. He will review the controls, evaluate their operation, recommend the improvement. Examination of financial and operating information. He will review how the transactions are identified, recognized, measured, classified, and reported in the financial and operating information. He will also make some specific inquiries into the individual items, like detailed testing of transaction balances, right? Then review of the operating activities, that is economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of the operating activities. Then he will ensure compliance with laws and regulation. Laws and regulation also includes the external laws as well as the internal management policies and directives, right? That is what we have learned. Then ways in which the external auditor may make the use of the function for the purposes of the audit. So मैंने बोला he can make the use of the internal audit function for obtaining the information relevant for the purpose of risk assessment, and then he can use the work of an internal audit function for as an audit evidence, and he can use the internal auditors to perform audit procedures under his direction, supervision, and review. Scope of SA 610 covers only two situations out of the above three. That is, obtaining information for risk assessment is always it's the ownership of the external auditor, and it can't be delegated to internal auditor, and you can't use the work of the internal auditor for it, right? So you can have that information from the internal auditors, but eventually it's your own responsibility that you need to own it up, right? Then scope of SA 600 standard on auditing SA 610 deals with the external auditor's responsibility if using the work of internal auditor. There are two circumstances जहाँ पे internal audit function ने जो काम किया हुआ है, I am using that, and दूसरा circumstance, I am directing the internal audit to say what they need to do, what needs to be done, right? So using the work of the internal audit function in obtaining audit evidence, and using internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So there are two words, that is internal audit function, using the work of the internal audit function, and then it's the direct assistance under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. Okay. It's not mandatory that you use the work of the internal audit function or you use the direct assistance of the it's not mandatory, right? It's the discretion of the external auditor. Then overall responsibility for expressing an opinion remains of the external auditor, and that responsibility is not reduced solely by the fact that they have used the work of the internal audit function or have considered the direct assistance of the internal auditor. So responsibility is not reduced, please note that. And then the reason for it is basically generally the internal auditors are not considered to be much independent of an entity, and therefore you can't. So SA 610 defines conditions which are necessary for the external auditor to use the work of internal auditors. These conditions are necessary so that you don't overuse or you don't make undue use of such work. And SA 610 also defines necessary effort work that needs to be carried out to obtain sufficient and appropriate work to carry out, which needs to be carried out to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the work of internal audit function or the internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate. It is adequate for the purposes of the audit. Then comes the objective of the external auditor. मैंने बोला बहुत simple है, इसको अपन एक flow chart से समझते हैं. The objective of the external auditor when the entity is using an internal audit function and the external auditor has determined and it is expected to use the work of the function. So I am using the work of internal audit function, or the second scenario is I am using the direct assistance. So expects to use the work of the function to modify the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures. Obviously, my audit procedures will go down, because I am relying on the internal auditor's work to some extent to be performed directly by the external auditor. So, जो work I would have directly performed, I am relying on the work that has been already done by the internal audit function. Yeah, I am thinking to use internal auditors to provide direct assistance to under my direction, supervision, and review. ठीक है. And for this you need to determine whether work can be used, क्या हम काम को यूज कर सकते हैं, in which areas and to what extent, क्या हम काम को यूज कर सकते हैं किन एरियाज में, to what extent. Then using the work of the internal audit function, you have to evaluate that the work is adequate for the purposes of the audit. And then using internal auditor to provide direct assistance, you should consider direction, supervision and review. ठीक है. So ऐसे it also defines the necessary work effort to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence that the work of the internal audit function or the internal auditors providing direct assistance is adequate for the purposes of the audit. तो आपको ये एविडेंस लेना पड़ेगा. ठीक है. अभी चलते इवैल्यूएटिंग द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन. तो आपको ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, कॉम्पिटेंस एंड आपको देखना पड़ेगा कि वेदर द ऑडिट फंक्शन हैव अ सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन अप्रोच इंक्लूडिंग क्वालिटी कंट्रोल. तो आपको ऑब्जेक्टिविटी भी देखना है, कॉम्पिटेंस भी देखना है, and the extent to which the internal auditor functions, organizational status and relevant policy and procedures support the objectivity, then competence, and then you need to also consider the application of systematic and disciplined approach. This is for the first part, that is using the work of an internal audit function. Using the work of direct assistance, we will consider it separately in some time. Okay. So objectivity आपको evaluate करना है, competence evaluate करना है, application of systematic and disciplined approach evaluate करना है. Objectivity means it refers to the ability to perform task without any biasness, undue influence or conflict of interest to override my professional judgment. What are the factors that needs to be taken to evaluate that the internal audit function is sufficiently objective is to consider what is the organizational status of the audit function, what is the function's authority and accountability, to whom the internal audit function is accountable. Let's say if it's accountable to TCWG, then it may be considered to be an objective function because TCWG are generally independent of the entity. But let's say if they are reporting to management, then we need to evaluate whether they can directly approach TCWG or not in case they have something to speak out, right? So we have to evaluate whether what is the function's authority and accountability that leads to that functions free from biasness, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override some professional judgment, right? And then it needs to be also considered whether TCWG directly oversee the employment decisions of the internal audit function. Let's say if the management oversees the employment decision of the internal audit function, that means, let's say if they report any findings, that then they might not give any good appraisal. So management might reduce the cuts in the salary, right? So we have to evaluate whether the TCWG is involved in the employment decision of the internal audit function, and that's very important to maintain their objectivity and independence, right? Then you also need to evaluate whether there are any constraints or restrictions, like internal audit function or management is imposing some restrictions, like that internal audit cannot directly communicate its finding to the external auditor. And then this last point is internal audit function is free of any conflicting responsibilities. Let's say I don't also perform that activity which I am reviewing. So let's say if I am reviewing the BRS and I am also part of the internal audit department, I want to evaluate the control activity. I want to review the control, right? Obviously, I will not be able to get it rectified. Obviously, because I am the only you can say person who is doing it. So internal audit function is free of any conflicting responsibilities. Are there any constraints or restriction, and whether TCWG oversee the employment decision and something of that sort, right? Then competence and its evaluation. Competence means it attainment and maintenance of knowledge. तो ज्ञान को लेना और उसको मेंटेन करना इस नॉलेज, उसको बोलते हैं कॉम्पिटेंस, ताकि वो अपना टास्क कर पाए diligently and can apply professional standard. What are the factors that you consider? मैंने बोला whether the internal audit function is adequately and appropriately resourced relative to the size. तो क्या internal audit function में अच्छे खासे बंदे हैं, adequately resourced relative to the size and nature of the operation. क्या there are established policies for hiring, training and assigning internal auditors to the internal audit engagements. क्या वो टेक्निकल ट्रेनिंग दी जाती है, एंड दे आर प्रोफिशिएंट इन ऑडिटिंग, है ना? एंड इंटरनल ऑडिटर्स पोजेस द नॉलेज रिलेवेंट टू द एंटिटीज financial reporting and the applicable FRs. तो क्या उनके पास ये knowledge है? Then comes the application of a systematic and disciplined approach. तो इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन ऑब्वियसली बात है प्लान करता होगा, परफॉर्म करता होगा, सुपरवाइज करता होगा, रिव्यू करता होगा एंड डॉक्यूमेंट करता होगा. सो अप्रोच टू प्लानिंग, performing, supervising, reviewing and documenting distinguish the activities for the internal audit function from the other monitoring control activities. आपको मैंने समझाया था monitoring of control can happen through two things. One is ongoing activity, that's part of the routine, that the controls are being reviewed and monitored to identify if are there any flaws in the operating effectiveness of control, and it can be done through separate evaluations. So separate evaluations are generally done by the internal audit department. So what are the factors that may affect the external auditor's determination of whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approaches? What is the existence, adequacy, and use of the internal audit procedures or guidances for the purpose of risk assessment, what audit programs, documentation and reporting, and what is the nature and extent of and whether the nature and extent of those guidelines and programs is you can say guidelines and procedures is sufficient relative to the size of the entity and the circumstances of the entity. Internal audit function has appropriate quality control policies and procedure. क्या internal audit function के पास quality control policies and procedures लगे हुए हैं to ensure that systematic and disciplined approach is followed while performing the function of the internal audit. ठीक है, तो अभी मैंने बोला कहाँ पे हम बोलेंगे कि यू कांट यूज द वर्क ऑफ इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन, तो जहाँ पे वो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी नहीं है, जहाँ पे वो कॉम्पिटेंट नहीं है, जहाँ पे वो सिस्टमैटिक एंड डिसिप्लिन अप्रोच फॉलो नहीं करते हैं. तो मैंने बोला व्हाट इज द नेचर एंड एक्सटेंट ऑफ द वर्क इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन दैट कैन बी यूज्ड. तो मैंने बोला नेचर एंड स्कोप ऑफ द इंटरनल ऑडिट फंक्शन वर्क कैन बी व्हाट कैन बी यूज्ड डिपेंड्स ऑन द व्हाट इज द स्कोप ऑफ देयर वर्क, राइट. So what is the nature and scope of the internal audit function, what they are covering, है ना, what has been performed and what is they are planning to perform, and how does it is relevant to my overall audit strategy and audit plan. So I have to consider the nature and scope of the internal audit function work that has been performed or is planned to be performed, and I need to also consider how is it that relevant to my overall audit strategy and audit plan. So what extent I can use, and what is in this, what is the area in which I can use the work of internal audit function is like example test of controls. I can think about using it. Then substantive procedures that involve very limited judgment, I can think about using it. Then observation of the inspection, inventory count, then tracing transaction through the information relevant to the financial reporting, and then testing of the compliance with the regulatory requirement, because this point is there because obviously internal audit function reviews the regulatory compliance with regulatory and legal requirements, correct. So circumstances in which the external auditor should use less of the work of the internal audit function and perform more of the procedures directly. For example, if all the significant judgments are to be made by the external auditor himself, okay, and he should use less of the work of the internal auditor and perform more of the work directly in the following situations, okay. तो मैंने बोला जहाँ पे judgment जा रहा है, the more judgment is involved in planning and performing and then evaluating the audit evidence, मैंने बोला hire the ROM auditor should directly perform that, and hire the wrong means it also includes the significant risk, and the less the organizational structure and relevant policies and procedures support the objectivity, and the lower the level of the competence, you should perform more of the internal auditor should perform more of the you can say more of the work directly, okay. So this is another thing. Then using the work of internal audit function. So this is what we have discussed. ठीक है. So using the work of internal audit function, तो हमने पढ़ा था the objective is to obtain that it is adequate for our purposes, right? So when evaluating, so जब हमने objective पढ़ा था, तो is to determine whether the work can be used in which areas and to what extent, and using the work of internal audit function to determine whether it's adequate and adequate for the purpose of audit. तो अगर हमें ये देखना है whether it's adequate, using the work of an internal audit expert is adequate for the purpose of audit, then we need to consider the below table. So external auditor plan to use the work of the internal audit function. So the following things needs to be considered. You have to discuss the planned use of its work with the function and what is the basis for that would form the basis for coordinating with them, right? And then you should read the report of the internal audit function to understand what is the nature and timing of the procedure, nature and extent of the procedures that have been performed by their team, and what is their related findings. And you should perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work. That is the nature of the procedure performed, the data that has been corrected by them. So you should perform sufficient audit procedures on the body of the work of the internal audit function as a whole that the external auditor plans to use to determine its adequate, so that you can determine that it is adequate for the purpose of your audit. अभी बेसिकली आपको कोऑर्डिनेशन करना है, तो आपको ये कोऑर्डिनेशन में क्या क्या डिसाइड करना पड़ेगा, ठीक है? व्हाट इज द टाइमिंग ऑफ द report, what is the nature of the basically the extent of the coverage, and what is the nature of the work performed, what is the timing of basically the such work, what is the nature of the work performed, what is the extent of audit coverage. Then you can also tell internal auditor about the materiality, then what is the sample method and selection that you generally use, then what is the documentation, you can say documentation of the work performed, and then review and reporting procedures. So these are the things you can coordinate about timing, nature, timing, and extent. And coordination between the external and auditor and the internal audit function is effective. कब माना जाएगा कि communication is effective? These are in three situations: when there is a discussion at appropriate intervals, external auditors informs internal auditor if there are any significant matters. Vice versa is also true. External auditor is made aware of, is advised, and is have access to reports of the internal audit function, and is informed of significant matters, the work of the which may have impact on the work of the external auditor, and he may consider the implication for the audit engagement. ठीक है, अभी हमने डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस की बात करी, तो डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस में सिर्फ 2 पॉइंट है. यू हैव टू इवैल्यूएट द ऑब्जेक्टिविटी एंड देन कॉम्पिटेंस. Systematic application and disciplined approach is not applicable here because the work is being carried out under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. तो मैंने बोला existence and significance of threats to objectivity and level of competence of the internal auditor. These are the 2 factors that you need to consider to evaluate whether to use the work of internal auditor in the form of direct assistance. Important point to note here, the word here used is internal auditor, and the word used in the previous phrases were internal audit function, right? So you have to evaluate the existence and significance of threat to objectivity. What is the level of competence of the internal auditor? The external auditor's evaluation of the existence and significance of threats to the internal auditor's objectivity shall also include inquiry of the internal auditors regarding the interest and relationship that may create threat to the objectivity. So it is mandatory to have inquiry with the internal auditors to ensure that they are sufficiently objective of the entity. ठीक है, तो inquiry here is mandatory, very important to note. ठीक है, अभी आप किन केसेस में यू विल नॉट हैव डायरेक्ट असिस्टेंस, जब आपको बताया है द इंटरनल ऑडिटर आर नॉट ऑब्जेक्टिव, दे आर नॉट कॉम्पिटेंट, देयर आर लॉट ऑफ सिग्निफिकेंट जजमेंट्स टू बी मेड. सो इन सिग्निफिकेंट जजमेंट्स वेयर देयर आर सिग्निफिकेंट जजमेंट्स टू बी मेड, he will not involve the internal auditor for the purpose of direct assistance. He will not involve where the assessed risk is higher and the judgment involved is more than limited, and he will not involve in those areas which has already been covered by internal audit function as part of its normal internal audit activities, right? So that will create the self-review thread. So it relates to the work with which the internal auditors have been involved and which has already been or will be reported to the management or TCWG, and it relates to the decision or external auditor makes in accordance with SA regarding the internal audit function and the use of its work or direct assistance. Okay. And what is the difference between IFC and internal control over financial reporting? So IFC means internal financial controls means these are the policies and procedures put in place by the management for ensuring the reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance with applicable laws and regulation, and yeah, so I don't know where I stopped due to some network connection, but let me just revise. What is the difference between internal financial control and internal control over financial reporting? मैंने बोला internal control over financial reporting only covers the controls which are relevant to the financial reporting, like consolidation, trial balance से balance sheet को बनाना, उसको review करना. But internal financial control refers to the policies and procedures put in place by the company to ensure reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations. So these are all the financial control. So internal financial control is much broader than the internal control over financial reporting, right? And when you are planning to use the work of the internal auditor for the purpose of direct assistance, you have to obtain an agreement from the entity as well as from the internal auditor will state two facts that he will maintain confidentiality of the specific matters as instructed by the external auditor, and the second point is he will inform the external auditor of any threat to their objectivity. दो points के बारे में वो written agreement लेगा and वो entity से agreement लेगा that the entity will not intervene between the work that has been given by the external auditor to the internal auditors. That internal auditors will be allowed to follow the external auditor's instruction, and the entity will not intervene in the work the internal auditor performs for the external auditor. So this is, and then we also learned in the following areas, in the work of the external auditor shall not use an internal auditor to provide direct assistance अगर वो objectivity नहीं है, competence नहीं है, मैंने बोला significant judgment involved है, या फिर higher assess ROMA that involves more than limited judgment, और फिर मैंने बोला relates to the already the work that has already been done by the internal audit function, like जब उसने internal audit function के हिसाब से कुछ काम किए होंगे, like review of the controls, if it relates to the same thing, then there is no need to basically involve him for the direct assistance, and also not for the decisions to be made in accordance with SA, that whether to go for direct assistance, whether to go for internal audit function or to go for nothing, right? So this is also that need not be done. Then we learned about this IFC and internal control over financial reporting. So that is what we have covered. Hope you have liked this session. So do let me know, and just give me a call on, you can say, the numbers given in the details. So if you want to enroll for this batch, so I will try to make the subject as much as practicable. So yeah, this is the demo lecture for the classes as well. Thanks. Thank you. Bye.